forestry and fire protection.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Without microphones, am I projecting all the way to the back of the room? Clearly. So, board members, we're using our outdoor voices today. Okay. We are at item 4 on our regular session agenda, announcement of action taken in executive session, and for that I'll turn to board counsel.
Thank you, Chair Gillis. During closed session, the board considered the 2 items on the agenda, the post-action group, the Board of Forestry, and the civil penalty CP 18-14 Buchanan. With respect to the civil penalty case, the board adopted the ALJ proposed with the minor modification of eliminating the payment plan language. The board took no other reportable actions. Thank you.
Thank you. We have the March 2019 and April 2019 board minutes and the board's rulemaking metrics on the consent calendar. I move that we accept the consent calendar. We can have discussion on that, but is there a second? Seconded from member Janai. Any desire to discuss moving forward with the consent calendar? Seeing none, please call the question.
Wade?
Aye.
Sorry? Aye. Janai?
Aye.
Delbar? Aye. Wheelis? Aye. Los Huertas?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
Thank you. For my own report, I will be brief. I want to thank Unit Chief David Hawks, the Unit Forester Dave Derby, and the Fire Safe Council's Callie Jane Deonda, and for organizing a really useful and informative tour for us of the campfire area. And as sobering as it was to see the destruction up close, I think that the tour served a very useful purpose for the board. It highlighted the importance of what we're working on here, that there was good discussion, I think, among all agency regulators and stakeholders about both what we could do to prevent recurrences like this or minimize the damage when we are faced with severe fire incidents, and the discussion about what we can do to recover. And so I thought the discussion was particularly valuable in terms of our understanding the collaborations between agencies, private industry, and communities that can lead to action on the ground. We did highlight, I think, for the board's edification, some of the problems and communication issues in how we move forward with actions and what are the best mechanisms, and not just funding mechanisms, but what are the best organizational mechanisms to move forward with fire prevention activities. But I, for one, found it very useful, even though it is hard to come away without great sadness from seeing that much impact on that many lives. And in this case, the impact, which I think was unparalleled, on a community of this size, to have the entire community so deeply affected. This is a fire incident that we don't have a lot of parallels for in the state. That normally, we have fires, they damage a section of a community, the community comes together, but I don't think we have an incidence where the impact on the community was so pervasive as this for a community of this size, to my mind, out of wildfire in the last century. So thank you for organizing the tour. Thanks to all the participants. And I think you did a good job of educating the board along with a large number of people that were along, like the Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources and other folks. It was useful for us all. Just for a second, anyone else from the board want to add anything to my comment?
Yeah. For me, I think the field trip highlighted the need for us to examine the relationship between the forest practice rules for the use of hazard reduction and which both the emergencies and the exemptions and the relationship between that and the CEQA required under the grant program. It highlighted to me that that there's a fairly high level of confusion on that relationship, and it made it, and I felt this for quite a long time, made it clear to me that we need to harmonize those things, because as you get close to communities, both practices are definitely having use, and I think with the grant program, it's operated separately under the operational and field side of CAL FIRE, but there's a real need to involve the foresters to bring in our rules. And since the reason I say that is because since the RPC was involved in grant development over a long period of time, and had a relationship with the SRA grant program, and now that's transitioned, of course, but it's still similar. If you look at the direction for how the grant program is run, and you're familiar with it, and I think, you know, the RPC members really do have a high familiarity with it, you can see the need for the board to also, the board and CAL FIRE, to harmonize some of that, to be more efficient when there is potential, there's a potential for removal of trees that are commercially within areas where we're also looking at potential use of grants. And to me, that's one thing in the rest of my term as on the board this time. It's something that's been in the back of my mind for a very long time because of my background, but also on my relationship with the RPC, that we need to move forward with harmonizing that, making it more understandable to the public, and I think it will meet the governor's objectives to do work in the right places. Because I see us on parallel tracks, not actually understanding what the two sides of it are doing. And as a small landowner, I also am really aware of that because of the small landowners, all of us. I mean, I only know what I know because I'm on the board. And my neighbors are pretty, I don't know if you feel the same, Katie, but that was my takeaway from that. And we could really make some headway there in hazard reduction in the state. So kind of a speech, but it's been in the back of my, it's been here. I've been ready to make it for a long time. So.
I fully support your comments, Sue. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. So with that, thank you to the community of Paradise and Magalia for allowing us in. We took away lessons that are valuable to us, so thanks. With that, I'm going to turn to report of the director. I believe Helge Ing will be standing in for Tom Porter, who is off doing the fire services good works with wildfire preparedness week.
Correct. Helge Eng, Deputy Director for Resource Management for Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. Can you hear me in the back? Cool. So Tom Porter, our director, is basically occupied with Wildfire Preparedness Week this week, and in fact today he is in Reading and Marin, both today, so he's busy. But I think it highlights the importance of fuel reduction and the importance of forest management, as Member Busari alluded to in mitigating and preventing some of these catastrophic wildfires. And to give you an example, yesterday, both Tom and I were in the joint informational hearing of the California State Assembly, where they wanted to hear about pre- and post-wildfire planning and the state's perspective. And interestingly, after literally 60 seconds, the discussion went to the campfire, and that was the focus of the attention for much of the hearing. So I thought that was interesting in the sense that you saw the destruction firsthand yesterday, and it really has grabbed people's attention. And it's interesting too that the hearing was really focused on a lot of the same issues that this board has been dealing with for some time. It's much more to it than just not building in high-risk areas. There is land use planning, there is connecting dead-end streets and providing ingress and egress. There is landscape level forest management, there is home hardening, there is the WUI fuel breaks. All of that was part of the discussion. And I think it really is a testimony to the fact that the governor gets it, the legislature gets it, and I think for the first time in a very long time in California, the entire legislature as well as the governor's office really starts to see how the forest management aspect drives a lot of this. So in a sense, I think something good came out of the tragedy, but it's something that we hope not to repeat this year. We, speaking of fuel reduction, we are, CAL FIRE is occupied with implementing the 35 projects under the governor's emergency proclamation. And those are, in fact, almost all of them fuel breaks, close to and providing protection to vulnerable communities. And in the development of these projects, we picked from the unit fire plans projects that were ready to go. And we had two main criteria, fire risk and vulnerable communities. So those two criteria were really front and center in defining the 35 projects. Out of the 35, 30 have now been approved by the Resources Agency, and all boots are on the ground. They are all boots on the ground. We are working on them as we speak in the field. An interesting learning experience for us is that CEQA clearance is only one part of the picture. You suspend CEQA as the governor did, and that removes a time limitation and enables you to get ready more quickly, but it does not remove all of the other laws and legislation on the books. So all of the other laws in California still apply, and we felt that we had to provide the same environmental protection as we did normally. So that was somewhat of an unexpected time sink, just navigating the waters without CEQA and working with our sister agencies, Fish and Wildlife and Water Quality. We got through it. We felt it was effective, but it was a new experience. As you know, once the VTP EIR is certified, we expect to hit a state-to-state equilibrium in the sense that we will no longer have to rely on CEQA suspension. And I believe that will make things a bit more predictable. But in summary, work is progressing on the ground. A quick fire season outlook. not surprisingly, we have had a good grass crop this year. So the heavy grass crop under a dense canopy of dead trees in the certainly in the central South Sierras will likely be a source of some fires this year. So once the heavier fuels dry out in June and July, we expect that activity will pick up. For the north, we are looking at near normal temperatures and precipitation through August. Of course, the generous snowpack will make a difference, but we do expect come August that we'll be looking at a fairly active fire season. We continue to work on the exemption and emergency monitoring projects, and we do appreciate the board's input on this. There are numerous non-trivial statistical challenges to the whole exercise, and I personally, as a statistician at one point in my career, find it fascinating, and to the point that my staff has told me to butt out, so I'm no longer allowed to stick my nose into the statistical wonders of the design. But I do appreciate the board's interest. Of interest, our forest and range assessment program is also working on a similar monitoring exercise of prescribed burning projects, and that's somewhat of our effort internally. But as you know, with the amount of fuel reduction projects going on, the amount of money the state is putting into this, clearly there will be expectations and requests for reporting of how is this going, what's the difference you're making. So we are contracting with Hugh Safford at UC Davis to provide field crews, and that effort is going forward in parallel with our exemption emergency monitoring. The California Climate Investment Program, funded by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, is also moving forward. As you know, we are looking at $200 million next year and $165 million this year, which is a sobering amount of money to spend. We have allocated so far about $60 million for the forest health fuel reduction projects, which is the landscape level forest health effort. We have allocated $43 million in grants to what we call the fire prevention program, which is closer to the WUI, focusing on fuel breaks. We have allocated about $13 million to urban forestry, and finally about $4 million to research. And again, the research angle is actually important because most researchers will tell you that Jerry Brown, our previous governor, as well as this governor, has gone out very aggressively to solve this problem with fuel reduction efforts. Arguably, the science behind the optimal treatments has not, it is not ready yet. We know a lot, but there's clearly much research to be done. And I think that's part of what Member Usari alluded to, that we need to do a lot of research in a very short period of time to come up with what are the optimal tree densities, residual basal area, and canopy cover for some of these forest management treatments. So we feel that's $4 million well spent, roughly equally divided between UC Davis Berkeley, and University of New Mexico. We are working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with Dennis Hall in the lead on a safe harbor agreement for the northern spotted owl for medium to small size landowners. And we feel we're making good progress, and we hope that will provide some relief for that category of landowners. After the 2017 Valley Fire, the Box Mountain Demonstration Forest is now once again open to the public with a lot of new trees in the ground, and we are basically done reforesting. We're looking at an ambitious program of early stand treatments and vegetation control for years to come, but we are ready. On Jackson State Forest, we have completed northern spotted owl surveys. Interestingly, while no nesting NSO have been found to date, we found more barred owls than spotted owls. So kind of a sign of the times. We are continuing to work on getting the nursery up to speed at the LA Moran Reforestation Center in Davis. And we have actually established a contact with private industry, Jeff Webster, Bob Reinierson, Tom Johnson, and others to help us. We're looking to form more of a formal advisory committee, recognizing that we don't know everything. And as you know, they have provided comments to the board, and we feel it's important to make use of that knowledge base in order to effectively get up to speed. And another tidbit, which I can't resist, our Forest and Range Assessment Program is working with the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Resource Station, Jeremy Freed and others, for intensification of the FIA inventory grid, resulting in moving from a 10-year remeasurement to a 5-year cycle to begin with, and then intensifying the grid with more plots in the second phase. I think that's money well spent. Excuse me, because again, data to allow us to measure the effect of our efforts, as well as how forest conditions change over time, are rare and hard to come by, and certainly FIA data is arguably the gold standard. So we think that's money well spent. The Black Hawk helicopters are continuing to arrive. The first aircraft are tentatively scheduled for delivery in early July. And we plan to retain the old helicopters, the Super Hueys, for now, and we'll be flying MX fleet. And once the new helicopters start arriving, we will start returning the Super Hueys to the United States Forest Service. Interestingly, they were loaned to us through the Federal Excess Property Program. They were not ours. So they will be returned to their rightful owner, the U.S. Forest Service. We expect they will continue to fly through other agencies. They've been well maintained, and there's no reason to not make use of them. Our mobile equipment program is actively releasing new chippers and track loaders and other equipment for doing fuel reduction work. An interesting wrinkle we ran into there is that local air quality districts require different permits and stickers. we found a solution to that. We hope we're working with the statewide California Air Resources Board, which has an interesting program named PERP. And of course, now I can't remember what's behind the acronym, but the program is intended to streamline local permits and thereby avoid.
Portable Equipment Registration Program.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's complicated. I know.
The Ventura Training Center began its class number 3, April 15th, 25 participants. We feel this is a winning formula, and for your recollection, this is for inmates that are already paroled, so they have finished their sentence. When they enter the Ventura Training Center, they're released from incarceration, but they have not yet completed all the requirements of their parole. They're on supervised release, so to speak. After they commit to 6 months of training and 12 months of crew time, they are off parole. They're free and clear. And so it's a win-win. The inmates gain from getting off parole potentially early. We win from training up fire crews. All the parolees to date are male. Our goal is to eventually develop the capacity to also include women. Speaking of fire crews, the statewide conservation camps population puts us at 71% of fire crew capacity. So we expect that to change, not to change for this season, and we're planning for that capacity. I declined to mention our fuel reduction crews. As you know, we received about $30 million in our budget to hire dedicated prescribed fire crews. And the hiring process is completed. Some are still in training, but most are on the ground working, and we certainly expect that they will be front and center in implementing the 35 projects. In addition, CAL FIRE and the California Military Department, also known as the National Guard, have signed a 12-month agreement for 5 20-person military fuel crews. And along with those National Guard crews, each will have 2 CAL FIRE fire captains and 4 firefighters, thus allowing 7 days a week coverage. These are dedicated to prescribed fire. They can be activated for initial attack, but the idea is that they will not be committed to long-term incident assignments. They will be returned to their fuel reduction duties as soon as they're done with initial attack. So with the National Guard, the 5 National Guard crews, the 10 CAL FIRE crews, that puts us at a pretty good capacity of 15 crews, and we think we can make some pretty good headway on the 35 emergency proclamation projects, which make up about 90,000 acres. A lot of that is depending on how fire season unfolds, of course. Fuel reduction likely will be curtailed during fire season, but we shall see. We are continuing to work on succession planning. We have a in number of people retiring, and 25 students successfully completed the Supervision 5 leadership class, which was focused on training the new leaders of the department, which sounds rather impressive until you realize that I was once deemed worthy of that class. So the bar is not as high as you may think. We continue to work with the Public Utilities Commission on implementing the new wildfire utility mitigation plans. We have completed the review of all of them, and the review documents have been submitted to the CPUC for their consideration. And we continue to work with the fire marshal on developing a list of low-cost home retrofits for AB 2911. The units are starting to update our annual fire plans. Staff is working on the annual fire plan report that will be presented to this board in the near future. So look for that. And lastly, the FRAP group, as well as the board, are working on the SRA review. And following this review, a remapping of the fire hazard severity zones will begin. And I think I'll leave it at that, and if you have any questions.
Board questions for Member Chase?
Thank you for your report, Helgi. Appreciate it. Question for you on the 35 projects. So received some CEQA relief to allow quick implementation of that. What's the plan to maintain those fuel breaks to ensure, we capitalize on the investment, they remain effective over time? Do you have to do CEQA for the maintenance activities down the road, or is that all included in the front end?
That's an excellent question that we've been asking ourselves, and we hope that since the projects were approved under the CEQA suspension, that we will not have to do a separate CEQA for each maintenance period. As you know, maintenance is required for these projects and could be as often as every 5 years. And we went to some effort to make sure that we explicitly accounted for the regular maintenance to keep these projects going in the approval process. We're hopeful that that will be enough. We shall see.
So I'll go to the end of your report. I'll get to the remapping of the fire hazard severity zones. So I guess it's kind of a two-part question. Is there any possibility that the metrics will change to harmonize with what's going on with the new hazard mapping that's being used for the utilities, or any changes based on any other criteria that would include, what they're including, which is basically weather, localized weather, or is it going to use the same metrics, just updated for the changes in ownership?
Right. I would expect that it would change. I do not have direct control over it. This falls under the fire marshal. But as you know, Dave Sapsis and others are involved in both efforts.
Right.
So yes, I expect that the lessons learned from the utility mapping effort will be put to use in the fire hazard severity zone mapping.
And also, well, that's great, because I think there's quite a bit of just the feedback the board is getting is that there's some level of confusion about having more than one system.
Yes.
Yeah, you know that, I'm sure. Okay, great, that's good news.
Member Janai?
I've been getting a little feedback on 35 projects, and I noted that there were 5 that aren't moving forward. You mentioned cooperation with other state agencies. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what the, what hiccups you've encountered working with the Coastal Commission on projects that are proposed within the coastal zone.
Sure. The 5 projects are a mixture of contract counties, LA County, Santa Barbara County, and one in particular involved the residents of neighboring communities in LA County and reaction against the prescribed fire project, part of the project. I believe they're working through that, and they may in fact drop the prescribed fire part of the project. And I believe that was near Santa Monica. One may question if Santa Monica is a vulnerable community, but we're into that project, so it's past that stage. We expect that project will go forward. The Coastal Commission, we are working with them. I think a general take-home lesson for us has been that it's very difficult for state agencies, or any agencies, CAL FIRE included, to completely let go of their process. But we found that with the direction from the governor, the backing of the Natural Resources Agency Secretary, that agencies are motivated to work with us to expedite the review process. So we're taking that approach, and that seems to be working. So we are expecting to get, we're hoping to get a coastal permit in pretty short order, within weeks rather than months. So we're happy about that.
Thank you.
Sure, remember, sorry.
So what about the project around Santa Barbara? Is that moving forward? I would expect that there could be some potential pushback on that one. Is that one progressing, or getting any feedback on that one?
Last time I checked, that is progressing, but yeah, it's kind of got the same kind of feedback mechanism with a more active population than you'd expect to see in Shasta or Siskiyou counties.
Right, at the Chaparral community.
Member Willis?
Thank you for the very complete report. Could you also include a written summary of the 35 projects going forward?
So,
They're not in the written report, and I think it would
oh,
be
okay.
probably head off of some of our questions, so just including some tidbits in there.
Happy to provide that.
Okay, a couple of questions for me, Hoagie. The Boggs Mountain report about vandalism.
Yes.
Does this strike you, or did it strike the agency as a directed target, or was this foolishness with a rifle? Or what's the outcome of the investigation?
The investigation is not completed yet, but my personal subjective take on it, with 10 years of experience as the State Forest Program Manager, was that it was the foolishness with the rifle aspect. And once the foolishness takes hold, then the tire slashing is the next step.
Yeah.
We did not see it as a directed attack.
Okay. I've had some comments made to me in various settings about the item that's in the director's report about the problems with CFIN.
Yeah.
Could you give us some comment on the status of that?
We like to think we're working through
This is page 4 of the director's report.
Right. And for background, the Fiscal program is a new accounting system that the state implements. So a new database and a new computer system. Things are not necessarily going as smoothly as expected. And
I take it that was Norwegian understatement.
I was actually paraphrasing the Japanese emperor in 1945, but yes, close enough. Yes, there are problems with rolling out that program, and every program, not just CFIP, is at the receiving end of that. But the complaints from notably small businesses that are waiting to get paid, who could potentially literally go out of business, is not something we take lightly. And so we have been pushing pretty aggressively, and in some cases just paid and plan to ask for forgiveness later. There is limits to how much you can do that, of course, and how long. So we're hoping that we will find solutions to this, and I think we have a couple of solutions that will enable us to push a system while the fiscal problems are being resolved. It's not ideal. It will consume more of our staff time, but I think it will have the intended effect of getting both advances out the door as well as the grants. So we're working on it.
Good. I mean, all new programs like that are tough. I know the university rolled out its financial system a few years ago. We found for 3 months all the purchase orders were going where the lost socks go before we figured out what was going on.
Glad to learn we're not the only ones.
Yeah.
It's every time.
Every time. So, but we do appreciate your working on this because we are hearing, especially from the small vendors, perspective that this is a problem. Very encouraged that you're moving forward with your discussions with the Pacific Northwest Experiment Station, and I absolutely agree with you that shortening the cycle is more critical than increasing the number of plots. And I think we're long overdue for doing this. The states that have done this in the past were mostly in the southeast with an industrial focus. We need this information for both industrial and ecological reasons if California is really going to move forward with its greenhouse gas management planning. So wonderful to hear that you're making progress on that. I think every state that's ever done this has felt it was money well spent, and I think we have double the reason of any other state to have made this move.
I agree.
I was very interested to hear your comment on the prescribed burning monitoring and, thinking in terms of the efficacy of our treatments, this need for a scientific basis there. I would be interested as you design that the board be kept informed, to the extent to which you're monitoring for impacts on wildlife or water quality so that we're not always arguing by anecdote about what the impact of these land management practices is on critical resources. So let's make sure we're generating something well above the level of anecdote out of this, but it's great that you're actually doing something that resembles what we say we do in the sciences, so this is great.
That's actually an excellent point. I know that both Chris Keithley and Hugh Safford would be interested in your feedback. I think we have a good mix of both practical experience and scientific insights on this board. So yes, we'll keep you in the loop.
Methodologically, are you thinking of this as a forward-looking monitoring, or are you thinking about doing any historical analysis, given that you have a fairly extensive now mapped inventory of activities on the ground as you've been developing your own internal GIS tools?
I would be interested in both. We have a somewhat limited budget, so given the requirements from the Air Resources Board, and we expect others moving forward, I think there may actually be some merit in spending more money than we currently do on the historical aspect, because like you said, we have the records, so why not? That's where we can get probably the most immediate feedback on effectiveness.
Yeah. Please, member, sorry.
So if I could jump in on the monitoring, since I always do. The Effectiveness Monitoring Committee would be interested in getting involved too.
Okay.
And I think it's all part of this. The other monitoring of the exemptions and emergencies, I think we can learn a lot from what Hugh would come up with, because he's done quite a bit about that. I think we are still interested. The Effectiveness Monitoring Committee is not looking at implementation monitoring, but I think there was a monitoring committee, a part of the board, which I don't think has met for quite a long time. And it might be a good idea to either reactivate that, to look at things like implementation monitoring, as opposed to just because you really have to do the implementation monitoring before you get to the point you do effectiveness monitoring. And I think we're missing that step. So either the reactivation of the monitoring committee to look at those issues, or expand I don't know whether that could be possible, or expand the scope of the role of the effectiveness monitoring to cover all types of monitoring, to advise CAL FIRE. And I think we could probably do that. I mean, member Los Huertas brought this up, that why isn't the effectiveness monitoring looking at the emergency and exemption monitoring? Well, we're not, because we're looking at effectiveness monitoring, and that's not what that is. There's a lot of confusion, but we did cover that extensively in the strategic plan, the types of monitoring, and I think we have a big gap. And that's my take on the monitoring. So if you'd be interested in having the EMC take a look at some of these issues, I think we could. But if we don't do it, someone needs to. So that's.
So I think, we need to discuss between agency staff, because this is really a multi-agency issue.
Yes.
And I think right now is the perfect time. Hugh is working on design and so is FRAP, and then we can work with board staff and find a way to report back to the board with something as a preliminary draft, and you can provide it. That'd be great.
Yeah, because the surface fuel issue, for example, obviously Hugh's going to look at that, before and after stuff with prescribed burning. That's always central to that type of monitoring. And it needs to be central to the monitoring of any kind of activity that we do that modifies surface fuels. I mean, if we're trying to analyze the effects on fire hazard and risk. So I think we're at the stage where we could do that. And we have some members of the EMC who have a lot of experience in that area. So maybe that's all. That's it.
No,
Yeah,
that's
sorry
great.
for taking a lot of time on this, but
I think we want to do this right.
Yeah.
I agree.
There's nothing worse than collecting data in a way which doesn't serve the purpose you want the data to serve. Or that misses a cheap opportunity to actually get a twofer where you can accomplish multiple purposes.
Goes back to your comments on statistics and the earlier effort. Yes.
And along those lines, in monitoring, this maintenance issue, which of course we all acknowledge, but what is the bill? Given the data management the agency's capable of doing now, are you developing sort of a master list of what the potential future maintenance issues might be from the projects that we're funding now? It feels like, as we're reporting back to the legislature, it might not be bad to have that information on prospective future management expense or timing at the very least, collected in a way, right, that could be added to over time.
That's a good point. Almost like a project planning database.
I think this could be done with the data you are collecting.
I think you're right.
Almost as a report drawn out rather than a big separate activity. And it could be of utility to have thought about how to do that and produce that information when it comes up. As you know, the information demands frequently that come on us that redefine the pace of all our activities, like the campfire, creating legislative activity, thinking ahead to what the data requirements might be as we continue this discussion between agencies, regulatory boards, the public, the legislature, the governor's office.
Exactly. And, quite frankly, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that Tim Robards is involved in this. I wouldn't be too surprised if he's already thought about it.
Yeah, so it just kind of fits into the whole monitoring issue, but
that's
looking
great.
ahead. So you mentioned briefly the SRA mapping exercise. The last time we went through this exercise, the board saw several appeals of designations. Is there much activity going on in the background where people are challenging the mapping, or did that go away with the greenhouse gas funds being used to deal with the SRA fee?
That's probably a better question for the fire marshal.
Yeah, if you don't have the
recollection,
information, you get back. But it is interesting to me to know as we're thinking about this remapping, we needed to budget a lot of time to think about how we did our outreach and explanation to the public. And we had hearings at times about different groups coming in questioning their particular mapping designation. I suspect that activity will have died down, but I would be interested to know, what's actually going on in the background, or whether we haven't yet triggered at the unit level the discussions which would lead to groups of homeowners coming forward and challenging.
It will come up as some of the new regulations, that were developed by the RPC come into play.
That's right. That would be a new trigger. Wouldn't
So the money will not be the trigger. These other regulations will, and as the legislature develops more, as this progresses, I think that will be the connection to how, as well as what's in high hazard. When that changes.
So if nothing else, there is a large communications effort that would be entailed then, associated with the SRA remap.
But we do need to anticipate, and I think Edith is well aware as staff of how that is going to progress. There she is, back there.
So, just a couple more quick ones.
Okay.
Your comment about, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One part before we move on.
Yeah.
And for me, it was the highlighting of the apparently arbitrary decisions of one side of the road versus the other side of the road that haunt me as also a former GIS person. I've done it since it's up the menus. But I wouldn't want those critiques of the past mapping to get lost because they aren't coming up anymore. Not because I am worried about the concerns around the arbitrariness, but I'm more concerned around, are we actually mapping high severity zones properly? For example, are we missing things is what I'm most concerned about, but also false negatives as well. So I would appreciate some analysis of false positives and false negatives somehow.
Using the retained critiques from past efforts.
Yeah.
It's a scale problem.
It is a scale problem.
Yeah.
I agree.
I will ask the fire marshal on that issue, but you're right, logic would dictate, back to the previous question, logic would dictate maybe pushback will die down, but with new regulations, we just don't know. I might add to the Box Mountain question answer, if that's okay. We found through hard-won experience on the state forest, and I'm sure other landowners have found the same, that if you maintain a clean site, a pleasant experience, if everything is cleaned up in order, people are less likely to vandalize and trash the site. People have done research on this for decades, from restrooms to state forests. And we were in the process of actually adding to the shooting range at Box Mountain State Forest and making it a more user-friendly experience. And so we're continuing that, and we'll report back on that experience and experiment and see how that works. But we really had pretty good experience with the shooting range and the clientele at Box Mountain State Forest. Then the fire happened, and everything is chaos and mayhem, and there's a lot of destruction. I think that may have had something to do with triggering that kind of vandalism.
Yeah. Right, when you've been used for sort of, yeah. The discussion about the Coastal Commission, which actually figured in an action, agency interaction in terms of in the April meeting where we had Coastal Commission asserting some authority, and we basically said, we agree, we don't challenge the authority, but we don't map your procedure into ours, right? Which I felt was the appropriate thing for the board. Is there any opportunity or need, do you think, to start discussions, within your interagency kind of world as to whether or not something like the THP lead agency role is part of increasing pace and scale? Just a thought.
With the Coastal Commission?
Yes.
I think it would be beneficial.
Because they've never been part, to my knowledge, of the lead agency discussions which facilitate other operations.
The projects are not going to go away, and yes, it's a large area, arguably in need of fuel reduction. A lot of eucalyptus was planted 100 years ago. It's now 10,000 stems per acre, waiting to go up. So, yeah, so I do think that'd be a beneficial thing to do. And I think that's actually one good thing about these 35 projects, that it's forced that to the front burner, and now it's in the Commission's radar, and we're aware of it, and this may be the right time to initiate that longer term discussion.
Thanks, that was really useful report, Helgi. Any final questions or comments?
I just have one quick one. Helgi, in the Jackson State piece of the report,
Right.
you mentioned that 3 new Merlot sites have been discovered potentially. I have a hard time believing that they weren't already known, or is this an issue of new standards for sites coming into play that have elevated them to potential?
It's a good question. I was not aware that they were known in advance. As you know, Jackson State Forest is a recovery habitat for the Marple Merlet. That may have something to do with it. To my knowledge, they were new discoveries, but I can find out. It's a good question. I was surprised too. I didn't expect that many.
Thank you very much, Helgi.
Thank you.
And is, so we're now at item 8 in our agenda, which is the report of Deputy Secretary of Forest Resource Management, Jessica Morris.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today, and thank you for facilitating that really sobering tour yesterday. It was incredibly helpful. One of the things that Paradise really shows us is a sobering reminder of the work we have ahead. And what's helpful statewide is that it's been a reminder for everyone. You know, it's on the governor's mind, it's on the legislature's mind, it's on the public's mind. And the severity of these mega fires that we've been facing year after year, and everyone's recognition of the compounding impacts of a century of fire suppression on top of now climate change, that we have to act. And so we have this opportunity now that only comes around once in a century to act. And we have to make sure that we are designing our strategies and our programs with the resources, the political will, and the public support we have in a way that will actually set up the next century effectively. That we have an opportunity that's not presented often to plan for forests, not just in terms of budget cycles and political cycles, but in terms of the ecological cycle of the forest. And we have the political will to do that now, and there is interest in big picture thinking, out of the box ideas, larger strategies and efficiencies that before often faced a lot of political or public headwind to get done. And so we are wanting to take advantage of this moment that we have to really do a serious reset on scaling up forest health and strategies. We recognize that forest health is part of a larger public safety strategy around fire mitigation. We recognize that we need to solve the insurance problems, and we need to solve home hardening and long-range development and how people live and engage in the WUI. And our piece of that puzzle is this question of how do we scale up forest treatment and forest health projects that will help mitigate not only the immediate dangers in the WUI and build fire breaks and fuels treatments like we saw yesterday, but also do that landscape level work. Because we recognize that when you build a fuel break and you do forest treatment, typically whoever is leading that charge is looking through one silo. You know, when you're talking with CAL FIRE, they're obviously focused on public safety. When you're talking with water boards, they're looking at watershed quality and yield. When you're looking at land conservancy, they're often a focus on habitat. And yet we all recognize that the science tells us that we can actually hit all of these markers with one project, that when we do a fuels treatment correctly, that it is actually improving watershed yield and quality. There's a chance for better biodiversity and habitat. There's an improvement of carbon sequestration potential. And so when we're looking at forest health projects, we're asking groups to start breaking down those silos and start managing for all of these outcomes rather than managing for one outcome and mitigating negative impacts on the rest. We saw a great example is one of these 35 projects that CAL FIRE is doing, where they designed the project in conjunction with the Native Plant Society and are building their slash piles in a way that's actually helping native plants like morning glories germinate better. And so they're seeing that the local environmental community is on board with this community safety fuels reduction project because it is actively enhancing the ecology in the area. There's a couple others where they are working with Fish and Wildlife to actually restore an ecological reserve by taking out snags and excess fuel that's enhancing the biodiversity in the region. We're looking at hearing great examples from groups that are looking at watershed restoration as a tool of forest management, and forest groups that are looking at watershed restoration as a tool for forest health. And so we're starting to see typical silos breaking down, and we really want to position ourselves to encourage that and support that effort. So we are looking at this broader strategy that says, how do we scale up forest health to the target set by the Forest Carbon Plan of 500,000 acres a year? You know, it's a good marker that helps us build an infrastructure behind it. And it helps us identify where the gaps are. And I've only been on the job a month, so we don't have the strategy yet, but we're getting there and looking for insights and feedback and input into this to ensure that we do get it right. So when we're looking at how do we scale up forest treatment to 500,000 acres a year over a 20-year strategy, how do we do that? What are the missing links? One of the big pieces that we're needing is exactly what you were talking about a few minutes earlier, which is this concept of a statewide mapping strategy. How do we really map and know where we are doing landscape level treatments, watershed level treatments, and identify where the gaps are? Then, so that we don't allow things like jurisdiction and land ownership to get in the way. Instead, when we have a 20-year plan that says, hey, we know what we're doing this year, we know what we're doing in 5 years, and we know what we're doing in 10 years, Suddenly, the project that's 5 years out, you know exactly when you have to start your spotted owls searches, and you know exactly when you have to start your CEQA process and the filings you'll need. And it suddenly makes the entire process much more proactive rather than reactive, and allows us to identify where the gaps are and where the partnerships are that we need to get on board to make sure that we're not doing a great fuels treatment in one area and suddenly the BLM land next to it and nothing got done. And suddenly there's an entry point for that fire. And so we're wanting to make sure that we are building those gaps, and a long range strategy that has this real plan behind it, that can show what we are doing, when and where and why, will help us have this more holistic approach and allow us to be proactive rather than reactive. One of the other gaps that we're seeing is workforce development. You know, that's across the board, everything from, you know, in traditional, hand crews and masticators and foresters. You know, there seems to be a big gap. I mean, you're all aware of this, that the foresters are retiring. And also, where are the women? So we need to start thinking about how we are recruiting and encouraging more foresters. You know, specifically, this is a task for the board, and how we encourage more women, because it's a lot easier to recruit when you're recruiting the entire population. And so making sure that we are setting up our programs in a way that is encouraging people to join, that's making it appealing for them to stay, and that's going to be a collaborative effort between all of us to make sure that these jobs are enduring. And obviously, workforce development has a much broader spectrum. We need to be focusing on community colleges, high school programs. We need to also start investing in secondary wood markets and ask ourselves how we also expand traditional wood markets. Where's that investment in capital going? Where's this source of people that can actually get their little micro mills into these neighborhoods and start taking out logs? I don't know why there's not high demand for hazard trees from Paradise. I mean, you'd think people in San Francisco would be delighted to have a dining room table with a Burns car through it, you know, that came from Paradise, and there'd be a niche market for that. But we need to start asking ourselves how we can start incubating small markets and non-traditional markets in the wood products realm that will encourage economic vitality in these rural communities and allow us to have the tools available so that when we say, hey, we need to get snags out of the forest, we have fuels reduction projects, we know exactly where all of that biomass is going. And there's a place for it to help self-sustain some of these projects. Long-term maintenance is absolutely one of our top priorities. It has not been typically sort of a funded priority, and I think having a more proactive 20-year strategy is going to help us really build that into the budget and build the partnerships and tools we need to ensure that these projects are maintained. You know, of these emergency projects, there's a couple that were fuel breaks set in the 80s that have now fully overgrown, that weren't maintained, and now you have to start from scratch again, rather than making that smaller, consistent investment in maintenance. And so that's a mindset shift that we're really working towards. And then the other thing we're really looking at, and we're here to support you with, is the Cal BTP, because, you know, the 35 emergency projects were a stopgap measure. But what we want to see in the long run is to have the BTP in place so that there is an expedited, transparent way for people to execute projects, upholding those high environmental standards, but removing that red tape. And so we are here to support, help, especially on the public front, on how to get that BTP through in a way that allows it to be a lasting tool for expediting this growth in forest health and treatment that we all understand needs to get done. So I'm happy to answer questions and really excited to have the opportunity to work with you. And we have huge opportunities available. And I'll just actually close on one idea for Keith, because, you know, for me, the lesson is that, you know, when you look at the history of the conservation movement, there was not political will for it early on. It was a radical concept to set aside land and protect it for future generations and future legacies. And you saw Gifford Pinchot and Teddy Roosevelt have to make a compromise, a political compromise, by saying, when they set up the Forest Service, they set it up in a way that it was going to be a fire suppression agency. and its entire mission was going to be fire suppression, and they had to frame it that way to be able to get it through Congress. And now we have a moment where we have the opportunity to let the ecology and the legacy drive our decisions and our planning and our strategy, and get the politics on board with that. We don't have to compromise the ecology of our forests to the politics anymore. And I'm standing here as a commitment to make sure we do that. So thank you, and really delighted to be working with you.
Questions for the Deputy Secretary?
Thank you for coming today and being here, and a lot of the things you said I think are wonderful, and by the way, you're a great speaker, so you did a great job going through that whole thing. And so, you know, as there's small landowners on here, and you talk about all these things that I think private landowners have thought about when they sit there and they look at their land and what they can do with it and what they can't do with it. And the that hits us every single time is regulation and cost, and being able to do something in your communities that benefits and brings in workers. Every single thing you try to do is stopped by paperwork and the lack of knowledge on how to get through the paperwork, and sometimes it's just, you know, the amount that piles on your desk to get through, and the liabilities and the taxes and the insurance. I mean, there has to be a way to streamline something so that you can actually get through this process, meet what California, you know, legislators think that you need to have on regulation side, and actually come out with a product that you can make some money off of, and pay for those fees and those things that are needed. But right now, I mean, it's just so cost prohibitive to do the things that we need to do in the state and with our own land. So as you go through, it's great when the state CAL FIRE can show up and do, you know, 25,000 acre, you know, clearing. You know, New Kaya is one that was done in the 80s. My dad sat on the board of supervisors. They had done this, you know, to field break, to clean it up and then it all went away. The city and the county were supposed to maintain it. It's never maintained. So taxpayers' monies were put out to do the work, and now we're doing it again. And so I appreciate your passion, but there are just some really, I don't know how we move down the road in a manner that we actually see something in the end. I hope we can.
Yeah, I mean, the struggle with small landowners is a huge piece of the puzzle. You know, we have small landowners who own about 25% of California's forests, and they're not a cohesive group. A lot of them are like I'm actually one of them, right? My family is land rich, cash poor, and you know, we have historic land that we've had since the 1890s. And I've got a cousin with a micromill who lives on it, and you know, does some selective logging from time to time, but he can't keep it up anymore. And so it's been sort of degrading over generations. And there's not necessarily the skill sets. You know, when you have land that gets passed down generations, those skill sets are lost. And so the question is, how do we work with landowners who aren't sort of really in touch with their forest land anymore, right? And don't have the capital or the resources to maintain it, and might not be looking to get a lot of money off of it, but do want to not have to pay, when you're looking at $18,000 to do a timber harvest plan, to even just do basic maintenance. I mean, it's daunting. And when for a lot of these owners, it's hard to even just pay the taxes on the land. And so coming up with a strategy around small landowners and sort of walking them through that process, that's something that when we're looking at, you know, we have the permits, right, with the cow trees and that concept. But one of the lenses I'm going to look at that through as we assess, is this working, is this not, where do we need to make adjustments, is this accessible to the general public? If you know nothing about forest land and trees, can you turn on Caltrees and get the tools and the support you need to get your land taken care of? And I think helping and supporting us on that mission is going to be huge. But one of our goals is to try to remove as many of the red tape barriers as we can while upholding the environmental standards.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I thought you were going to bring this up, but it's so important that you also incorporate that 50% of SRA is rainforest.
Right.
And we,
Yeah, I got hooked in another direction.
I know you did, but,
And here I should be talking about rangeland.
well, I'll just
Thank
chime
you.
in that the importance of that type of activity on private land and involving ranchers is, I just can't emphasize
Yes.
it enough. Because when you see, like, I live in Sonoma County, okay, you know, who does the field treatment in Sonoma County? Sheep and cattle. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So we need to remember that and make sure that, given it's 50%, that we incorporate that and bring in more people. We have a committee, but I think there's more work to do.
One of our standing committees is a range management advisory
Oh, fabulous.
committee.
But that is the only venue to the state of California, correct?
That's correct, and.
We are the only connection.
Oh, interesting, okay.
Isn't, I mean,
And
that's
member Del Var
Yeah.
is the designated range
That's what-
appointee to
Yeah.
the board.
Well, that's something we're really interested in because, I saw out in, Tuolumne County, for example, small goat herders who, don't have who are taking their goats, day by day. They are clearing, they're being brush goats. They're an amazingly efficient fuels treatment crew. But there were a lot of barriers, especially for smaller farmers. Because it seemed like the Farm Bill was a big barrier. But I'll be very interested to understand more about what we can do to facilitate and support grazing as a tool of fuels reduction. Really incorporate that into our maintenance strategy because it's going to be a huge part of that. I mean, I've seen those cows take on like chaparral shoots and
And just, if I may follow up real quick, since you brought it up. We do have a subcommittee with the California Cattlemen's Association has been really working on this. We have a subcommittee that I'm on. We're meeting with the director hopefully in July to talk about it of CAL FIRE. The concern about getting, livestock on the lands even after the fires. So what we see now, what you see if you look at the Rocky Fire, the Valley Fire, Jerusalem Fire is now it's all, we've got all this grass and overgrowth. And a lot of it's also BLM land in there. And we're not going back in and tending that, where there should be livestock or something back on those lands. It's just set for another fire. And Lake County continues to burn, and that's one of the reasons is we have a fire, we don't go back in and we don't maintain, we don't encourage it or talk about it. So there is I know, we are working on it on other levels, but your help or assistance would be very appreciated.
Yeah, and I hope that's kind of the big takeaway here is that, as we're designing this sort of bigger strategy, which will then have a budget put behind it, right, that we want to make sure we're taking sort of these best ideas, good practices, and ensure that we're incorporating it into a broader strategy so that it demonstrates where this all fits in. That as we have a 20-year plan of where we're doing treatments and how, that a lot of that where it's appropriate to be doing grazing and rangeland, that's integrated into that strategy really clearly.
Yeah, member Chase.
Thank you for your enthusiasm. Your presentation was excellent. We look forward to working with you. Got just a couple of points, one on small landowners, one on infrastructure, and then one on interaction with the Forest Service. Really glad to hear that you've got a good understanding of some of the challenges that small timber landowners face, and I echo Member Del Var's comments on that. The impact of the cost and complexity of regulatory compliance in the state really can't be overstated. That it's preventing a lot of landowners from managing their properties because they just don't get it. It's complicated and consequently they don't manage. We get overstocked stands, higher fire risk, a lower hurdle rate to conversion to another use, and it's a huge issue. And we even saw some of that yesterday on the tour.
Yeah.
And Member Gusari brought this up early on in the meeting. And even a group that's immersed in this stuff on a daily basis doesn't really understand all the tools that are available and all the potential mechanisms to address these problems. And so to the extent we can reduce the complexity, make it more straightforward, and then get the information out there so that the landowners can understand, that will help to encourage management, help landowners retain that land in timber production as timberland.
Yeah.
And that addresses all those other beneficial uses in the forest that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So I think we're in line there, and to the extent we can keep marching forward and reduce the complexity and cost, that'll help. With respect to infrastructure, and I agree with you on niche markets, there's some great opportunities out there. Niche markets kind of attach themselves to these larger, base load consumers of large quantities of wood fiber that are needed to keep the whole system rolling.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the areas that have a high density of secondary manufacturers and niche products, they tend to be in areas that have a high density of infrastructure overall, because they're skimming off that top 1% or that bottom 5% or whatever it is, specific grades, and in order to do that, you have to move the volume through, and you need some larger consumers of that fiber. And what really drives the consumption of that fiber is the base load green volume that's offered on an annual basis over time. And absent that, we really struggle to absorb in the state those pulses of salvage that come up periodically in market areas, because the infrastructure is geared to convert the average volume that's produced in a given year. And so what we need to do is elevate that and expand it to other parts of the state, so that when we get these salvage events, green sales can be suspended and that pulse of salvage can then be absorbed. And that quickly leads me to my third point, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the U.S. Forest Service. And at least in my mind personally, the two biggest opportunities that we have are one with the private non-industrial sector, and second with the Forest Service. And as I'm sure aware, we've had numerous discussions about, there are a number of tools that can now be used to help encourage and promote management on federal lands, and master stewardship agreements with neighbor authority. Several states have done a really good job of embracing those new tools, and Idaho particularly has done a good job. California, we've got some challenges here, but we also have some financial resources that these other states have. So really, really encourage you to look hard at that and interact with the Forest Service and look for opportunities to engage with them, provide the seed money so that they can come up with a self-sustaining program funded by stumpage revenues that allows them to increase pace and scale on a financially sustainable basis, because this $200 million a year isn't going to be there forever, right? Yeah. So just addressing this for 5 years isn't going to get us where we need.
With that question of sort of inconsistent supply, I guess is that the right way to describe that. So I'm not the technical expert on forest, so we're just going to set that baseline really clearly. But with that inconsistent supply, are you seeing sort of that 10-year master stewardship agreement with the Forest Service really making a big sort of on the ground impact? I mean, it's just started, right? But are you
gradually ramp up, production of the volume on a sustainable, non-declining, even flow basis off of federal lands and some additional private lands in various market areas, that'll attract the capital. And that's what's going to do it. Grants and incentives, and they're helpful sometimes, but for most wood products manufacturers, 70+% of their cost is in the cost of the raw material, right? So if they don't project a long-term sustainable supply, they're not going to invest the money to build the mill. So or buy the equipment. Exactly. So to the extent we can focus on increasing that base load of volume, that attracts the capital, which creates the infrastructure, which provides the outlet for the material, which funds everything else. And with the rising cost of trucking, which is driven by a number of factors, really limits the economically the haul distance, the size of various market areas. Just in the 20 or so years that I've been doing this, per hour trucking rates have doubled. And that has a straight line correlation to how far you can truck logs.
And infrastructure siting in the state. is we used to have a well-distributed infrastructure prior to the listing of the spotted owl. When the federal program went out, so did many of our sawmills. And that we've got to start thinking in terms of reestablished infrastructure where the forest is.
Yeah, our infrastructure adjusted, and at this point I would say is well adjusted to meet the supply on private lands. And the harsh economic truth is that a disaster like the drought mortality and beetle kill will not generate the capital investment for an asset that has a depreciation life of 30 years. Right? It's got to be an ongoing timber supply, as Member Chase has said, to motivate the investment to restore some of that infrastructure. And it is absolutely true, if you look at stories of local economic development, that if you're going to develop these niche sorts of markets, they are generally piggybacked on clusters of other industrial material where you've got movement and shipment into an area. We'll probably never get the benefit that, say, co-locating the paper and lumber industry got in areas that are more well supplied with water, like Washington and Oregon. You know, that strategy won't work for us, but there are other strategies that could that are not so water dependent. But it does mean you need an infrastructure that facilitates a transport mechanism, because as you know, in contrast to the paper industry, most of these other markets transport raw material costs, including its transport to the processing location, is a huge cost component. That's one of those economic development issues that I know you're interested in. We do have some issues, not just in fixed infrastructure across the state, but for a variety of reasons that members of the board understand, there is a problem with our transport capacity. You know, and so even at that level, you'll only see marginal investment, I think, in declining transport capacity in the state in response to a short-term emergency like a big need to move material around in response to the kind of mortality we saw in the hills. I think, you know, we need to avoid making the Sierra a log deck of material we can't transport anyway.
And Keith, could I comment on the
Please.
Forest Service? You know, I come from the Forest Service, and I agree with you, but the precipitous decline in timber coming off the Forest Service is, I believe, due, you know, we say it's a spotted owl or salmon or some other species-related concern. My take on it is that it's actually a socioeconomic issue and the changing demographics of California that drove that, and the change from a rural to a more urban population who then moved out to the WUI. And you would know that because you come from around Grass Valley. So I think we need to be,
Their policy environment has
their
evolved
policy
very
environment
rapidly and negatively
because it was
to their
precipitous.
operations.
I lived through it in the agency. It went from, you know, during my career is when it happened. I was on the Klamath as we took out the last of the big trees on the Klamath. And, you know, and clear cutting was the issue that began, because you started with the conservation movement. I think it's very complex, and I think you're aware of it. And the board needs and has adjusted to this real big change in the public perception as a whole towards the issue, and we need to be cognizant of that. We're not going to be able to go back. That's my point. We're not going back, so we need to find a way to go forward, and we're part of the solution. Bashing the Forest Service, you did not, but there is an undercurrent of blaming the Forest Service for everything that is really a larger socioeconomic a shift in California that will not change, you know.
And just to clarify, I
Yeah.
agree
Oh,
with
no, I
everything
know.
you said. I'd like to see us partner with the Forest
We
Service
have to help
them achieve their goals, which in
Yes.
turn address California's goals and, provide a more substantial wood supply to support the infrastructure. So I think we can have it all.
That's right, and I think your position in the Resources Agency is a particularly powerful lever here. This board does have a formal charge to represent the state interest with respect to federal matters.
Mhm.
But we don't have much leverage to express that interest.
Mhm.
The way funding for land management has evolved in the state, along with mechanisms like Good Neighbor Authority, actually gives the state a significant role in coming to some sort of cooperative arrangement with the Forest Service, which meets both the agency's need for a perceived change in its operations limited by a variety of things, if nothing else, just the fact that their fire suppression budget became a black hole that,
Yeah.
is absorbing all money to the agency and pulling it away from programmatic spending. But the balance of resources has shifted to the state, and that changes the discourse. And because money is involved, and we are not a group that gets into the appropriations or prioritizations of the state funding, that does give the Resources Agency more than a bully pulpit to further this discussion. And I'm happy you're in this position because I think you'll take that discussion on.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's about it's about this comprehensive strategy of recognizing that this federal land is 57% of California's forests. And so even if we as a state alone actually hit these targets of 500,000 acres treated a year, it would take us about 30 years to get through the 15 million acres that have been deemed sort of in danger throughout the state. And so we cannot do that without the federal government at least matching this, whether it's through good neighbor agreements or through public pressure and perception to get them the resources they need to be our partner, and through us finding ways to help offset those costs through secondary wood markets or expanding the capital need, expanding traditional wood markets. And I think, one of the public dialogues, just so you have a barometer of how I'm thinking about this, as opposed to this is not sort of official agency policy yet, but it's important that we start looking at this holistically. What does the state pay for wildfire catastrophes? What does it cost us in terms of fire suppression? What does it cost us in terms of emergency relief? What does it cost in terms of economic loss and livelihood and tax-based loss from all of these people who are displaced and devastated? What does it cost in terms of watershed cleanup and restoration and the cost to watersheds down the line? Sort of calculating that more holistic cost of what we pay helps make it a much easier argument for saying, hey, we may need to support some nascent industries here. We may need to invest and expand capital because it turns out it's cheaper to start doing forest treatments and expanding forest health than it is to allow sort of another 20 years of catastrophic wildfire. The part that's going to be really hard and where we'll need some really strong messaging support on this is that we are going to have, years ahead of us of catastrophic wildfire season. That no matter how much we are treating and how many fuel breaks we're putting in and the communities we are saving, our environment is in a state right now that it's going to take us a while to get ahead of the curve. And so while we are sort of doing full throttle, all hands on deck, agencies are coming together, the public sector is coming together to really get ahead of and be proactive about forest treatment and wildfire mitigation, we are still going to have these massive wildfires that will be very demoralizing for the public, and they will put their hands on their hips and say, what have you done? And so we need to be able to demonstrate a cohesive strategy that gets us there, and I am very eager to use this position to make sure we get it done. And that's why I'm encouraging a lot of you to come join us. We're going to be using the Forest Management Task Force as a vehicle for developing the strategy, getting the dialogue up, making sure that we've sort of looked through every link of it, whether it is access to big capital or the smaller sort of local entrepreneurs, and every level of the strategy that is going to be an important piece of the puzzle to get it done, and ranching. And so come join us on the Wood Products Working Group. Come join us on these working groups to ensure that we're committed to making sure they have specific targets, real outcomes, and are a voice for the community, and will inform the strategy that we have going forward.
Thanks. And, I'm sorry, Member Sortos.
So I'm hearing the issues around small landowners.
Yeah.
And I'm also have had a lot of experience around that with resource conservation districts. So
Right.
these districts are incredibly uneven in the state in terms of their capacity, their grant writing capacity, their knowledge of the environmental issues, their capacity around forestry. And I don't know how to say this in a stronger way, but the state needs to do a way better job supporting resource conservation districts.
Okay.
Because I think they are the key to many contacts with the small landowners, especially because they can identify watersheds or regions and prioritize those areas and get to know those people and be the people that know those landowners in a really more holistic way than even CAL FIRE can do.
I think that came out with the Fire Safe Councils. I think it's great to have that
Yeah.
the resource conservation districts are in the same category, and we have to thank, both for effective policy, but also stakeholder engagement. We need these groups to be functional. So that's great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and I like your historical focus
There
as
you
a
go.
student of
Yeah.
history. I've always said it's about the time that the children of John Muir, the children of Aldo Leopold learn to play together nicely, because that's the only way this is going to work. But thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you more.
Thank you.
Comment from John Anderson.
Yeah, Jessica, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to go out with us yesterday. There's no better way to learn about this issue than go out and see it, of course. And I know you've been up there before, but from our perspective, the forest treatments that we see it need to be done. So, in your time this morning, I also want to let you know that, as you know, the California Forestry Association met with you, and we discussed a lot of things. You had your report today, and Rich Gordon from the CFA is very close to having a report back to you, and Jennifer Montgomery on more details on that, and some of the questions you had that need. Workforce development, infrastructure, synchronizing of our permits, all that type of information. You'll see it, I'm sure. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, it was really an honor to be working with all of you. It's exciting that we're all hands on deck. I think that I'm seeing lots of different perspectives being brought into the dialogue, and a lot of collaboration, which I think is not standard in a lot of resource areas. And so it's pretty exciting that we get to kind of set this model of cross-collaboration across private sector, local NGOs, governments, and then different layers from federal, state, county, and these local groups that we need to have a comprehensive, not just a dialogue, but comprehensive action together. And so really excited to be working with all of you.
Thank you. Please, Richard.
Equal time, please. We were with CFA. No, this is going to be difficult. This is a task that's not, and other people don't realize that this isn't about cultural change, deep cultural change. A lot of people, a lot less resources. The whole other ballgame, the people that are living on the fat of the cow, and it's not like that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Matt, I think how long would you anticipate for the report of the executive officer?
How long would you like me to go? No, I'm just kidding. You want to take a break?
Well, I'm wondering whether I should have you come up first or take a 10-minute break.
I'll probably be 10 minutes.
Okay, let's bring you up. Let's go through your report, and then I'll
I can make it
have a
quick.
break.
I've done this a couple times, so I think I can get through pretty quick. Matt Diaz, Executive Officer. Good morning. I'm going to cover basically program issues at this point, rather than speaking to some of the subject matter we've been talking about this morning. Although I do want to cover one thing. RCDs, as mentioned by Member Los Huertos, I believe too is a very key component to the infrastructure of our state as it relates to reaching out to small landowners. But at the same time, you'll recall that this board heard from Todd Slowdown of Fall River and Pitt River, where they were engaging with the Forest Service through stewardship contracts and having a recycling effort in terms of fiscal recycling, where they were, and so my point is, RCDs are very important on all aspects, I believe, as we move forward. And I think that's an innovative model this state should continue to research to build out into the future. Okay, so getting to program issues, staffing update. With the promotion of Eric Hedge to a Forester 3 and running your regulations program, we have a vacancy as a Forester 2, his former position. We're working rapidly on getting that position flown. We should be out here relatively soon. We're hoping to get a robust set of applications on that position. We recently flown our Connor Papa. He stepped aside. We flew his position not too long ago. We got some very good candidates, interviewed them last week. We've selected the candidate. He's been vetted through CAL FIRE HR. And I think that we'll be offering him a position here relatively soon. Very excited about him. He was a great, he conducted a great interview with us. I was very pleased. And I think Eric was pleased as well. Suhani Patel, who's worked for the licensing program for 6 years, actually tendered her resignation this morning. And so we will be, she has accepted a promotional opportunity with the Office of State Fire Marshal. I always encourage all my employees to, promote if you can. And it's good for CAL FIRE, OSFM. It's good for the Health Department Board to have a little bit of turnover. We have a strong skill set within our staff, so I'm not feeling as though we're going to be.
It's not a return to the dark days of 4 years ago.
It is not. It is not a return to the dark days. Thank God. I would also like to report that Nadia Hayes, who's been supporting you in the 1504 effort, if you recall, provided a presentation 2 or 3 months ago and said that she'd be leaving on maternity leave. I contacted her the other day. She is the proud mama of a new baby girl named Cora. She's doing very well. And so I try to contact her at least once a month, talk in and see how she's doing, just on a personal level. She'll be on leave for a while, but I contact her pretty often just to say hi. Budget updates. We are experiencing some budget woes, if you will, primarily as they relate to the licensing program, as well as keeping up with the costs associated with working on your CalBTP. The May revise will be coming out here very soon. We have some BCPs that have been supported by DOF, modified but supported, and I'm hoping that the May revise will reflect that support in the near future.
Sorry, I missed at least half of those acronyms.
I was just going to stop him.
I'm trying to go quick because I want to.
You knew an acronym no one else knew. Do you know these things?
We as your staff have addressed a couple budget issues. One of them is your licensing program, which is currently not really all that sustainable based on the level of attrition that we've experienced within the RPF population. We're looking at opportunities to try to bring that back. That would be looking at licensing fees, but also looking at some supplement, if you will, from various funds within state agencies. And I think we're going to get small support on that front. And I'm hoping the May revise reflects that. When I say BCPs, there is a process that you need to go through where you submit budget change proposals. It goes through a process where Department of Finance will eventually review and approve and modify. And we've done that on 2 fronts, both licensing as well as CalBTP. And those acronyms are basically saying we're in a good place as of right now, in my opinion. I want to also indicate that Forest Practice Committee for much, and all through last year, and Member Wade, you'll be interested in this, was looking at northern spotted owl issues. And this board's really struggled with northern spotted owl. What to do, when, how to do it, what kind of opportunities are available to this board. I've been engaging with a small group of leaders from CAL FIRE, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, myself, and DFW, trying to develop solutions to issues that may be present out there, opportunities, pushing on regional SORPs, pushing on possible safe harbor agreements. Because without some of these things being present, it's going to be very difficult for this board to make much in the way of a true change that's going to represent a positive trajectory for both the conservation of the species as well as the efficiency in permitting, in my opinion. So I just want to report that we're continuing to work on it, but it's in the background at this point.
Was the inventory both the inventory and the procedures for maintaining the inventory for activity sites that the board had heard testimony on recently. Is that a part of your discussion?
That was part of our discussions. That we've been involved in these for now 3 or 4 months, and that was one of the discussion points early on. But I will say that DFW had taken that effort on prior to us engaging. So we were tracking it for that group to a certain extent, but they'd already been working on it. Contracts. Our program has grown, as you all well know. Along with that, so has our contracting process. And we are struggling with contracts on various fronts right now. The EMC we're doing okay. We're doing all right, but the EMC has several contracts in the works right now, and the Joint Institute for Innovative Wood Products also has several contracts in place. Part of those challenges is the overhead associated with engaging with universities on both UC and Cal State level. And so the overhead rates are a challenge for us right now. I do believe that I believe that next month we're going to be bringing forward to this full board a draft policy for your consideration that's going to maybe cap what this board is willing to engage in on all contracts. Rather than doing it through individual EMC or doing it through the individual committees, I think this is something that the board could have a discussion on. We have Keith as a former dean at Cal, has some background in this knowledge. I'm sure Mark as well. So I think that there's some opportunities to have a robust discussion about this and maybe adopt a policy that we can feed the contracting process at these universities that are going to say that this is what we can withstand in terms of overhead rate right now.
Yeah. It's not that there will be a parallel with the board because of the different empowerment for boards, but so the California Department of Food and Agriculture, not their board, but the agency has had extensive discussions with both the CSU system and the UC system over the last 3 years on exactly this topic, and came to a general resolution which might be useful that could come either out of the Resources Secretary, because this involved the Secretary of Food and Agriculture, or it might be down at the director level. So I'm happy to be a resource kind of on the historical policies on that. But I do think there are analogs to resolve questions on this contracting.
State board's done this. State water board's done this too.
So you within your halo, it's enough of an issue that it has been hashed out in the last few years in other environmental venues.
All right, we will look into that. Jeff and I will be on it. SRA, we've already had a lot of discussion about the SRA designation. It is your mandate to redesignate the SRA 2020. We're getting that started now. We're having a meeting next week with OSFM leadership. We are going to get our planning together in terms of the schedule, starting from the local level and bringing it up to the regions and ultimately state and then to the board, or to headquarters and then ultimately to the board. So the comments that you have provided today will be provided to OSFM next week in terms of our planning for that process. The legislative update. The legislative update's a heavy one this year. This is very reminiscent of last year, although the issues are a little bit different. Last year we were very forestry based, right? This year we're not looking at the forestry issues per se as much as we're looking at the land use planning side of things. Home hardening, planning on where, when, how to build, so on and so forth. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, and then I'm going to stop in my presentation for the day. But we're going to start with 1160. 1160 is actually on page 1. AB 1160, it is looking at extending the sustained yield plan for a period of a decade. It's currently valid for up to 10 years. I think this is a well-supported piece of legislation. I think this board generally would support that. I just want to point that out, that that's an important piece. And in fact, documentation coming from this board in the past supported that SYP extension. On page 2, Senate Bill 69. This would be something that I think is a challenge for this board to accept, maybe. This would be extending the ASP rules statewide. Now, this board, as you well know, spent years working on the development of the ASP rules, applying them geographically and specifically to watersheds that support anadromous salmonids. This piece here is extending that on a statewide basis under the auspices of ocean resiliency. I'm not really sure how, or I'm not sure of the linkage at this point, if it's water quality, if it's anadromous salmonids, I'm not sure at this point, but this is one that we are closely tracking and are having conversations with folks about. AB on the following page, AB 1823, it's a cleanup bill from last year as it relates to the fire risk.
Interrupt on.
Oh, yeah.
If at some point it becomes necessary for the board to put a comment letter together, I would suggest that maybe Member Wade, Member Los Huertas, because of expertise, might be a good committee of two if we have to move fast on this.
If we're going to submit a comment letter,
Given the amount of heavy lifting you did in over, what, 8 years or more on the whole road rules.
It seemed like 8 years, it wasn't quite that.
It was a long time, yeah. But I think we might.
Back to the original code protection.
Yeah, so I think if it is appropriate, I'm glad that you were involved in tracking this, but if we need or are in a position to make formal comment, come back and clear with me. But the two of you, I believe, would be willing to put together a comment letter.
Okay, copy. AB 1823 is essentially a cleanup bill as it relates to the I forgot which one it was last year, 2911 last year, for the fire risk reduction community list that you'll be developing. He has been working with folks on that particular piece. Gaugiani, the next one in line, SB 632, very important piece, I believe, for this board. It addresses specifically the Cal BTP, trying to assist, I believe, this board in getting that document certified and allowing it to move forward in terms of subsequent activities that would be tiered from that document. The following page at the bottom, AB 394, introduced by Obernolte, provides this board the potential mandate to exempt projects from CEQA as they relate to wildland fire prevention. I don't have a lot to say on this particular bill at this point. We're just tracking the changes. I believe that there's going to be some significant amendments to it in the near future. Safety element review is addressed under Senate Bill 182. I'm just going to leave it at that, but this is something that members of RPC are familiar with the safety element review as the entire board, but it addresses that process specifically. The last one I want to bring up is it's not actually on your list, but it does address workforce development to a certain extent. It's AB 482, I believe, is the number, and it's looking at community colleges and trying to. It is advising the chancellor to develop forestry programs, wildland fire prevention programs within the various, within the curriculum of the junior colleges within the state of California. At this point, the way that I see it is that it's not congruent with the professional foresters law, and it may not provide that track to getting individuals that participate in those curriculum to become registered professional foresters in the most efficient way possible. So I think that we're going to be reaching out on behalf of this board to try to just make some minor changes or suggest some minor changes so that individuals that may participate in these programs could bolster the RPF program, ultimately maybe addressing some of our budget challenges as well, because we're building the numbers, and then also just addressing the pace and scale issues, the wildfire prevention issues that the state's trying to address as well. So
do we have, just for staff purposes, do we maintain an active index on status and graduates from the community colleges that were historically involved in sort of a research management or forestry AA curriculum, Readly, groups like this?
No,
because the logical place to start would be with the colleges that have some kind of educational infrastructure, it seems to me, already in place, which is, it's a small subset of the community college. Well, it's,
Yeah.
right, but everywhere as opposed to centers of excellence. So it might be interesting to have available as these discussions move forward for the department to have, what are the status of these programs? A few of them were low enrollment and having some issues with continuity.
Yeah.
And
True.
I would welcome seeing those programs be rejuvenated.
Yeah.
Member Janai.
I just came from a meeting of the Dean's Council down in San Luis Obispo. And we spent a considerable amount of time talking about the community college programs as feeder programs
Right.
for both Cal, Humboldt, and San Luis Obispo. So they are targeting and going to spend resources in trying to pull people into forestry at the university level out of those programs.
Half of the forestry students at Berkeley are community college transfers.
Yeah.
And Cal Poly is up there ante on that. So I think it's important that we do whatever we can to facilitate that.
Yeah. Member Chase.
With respect to RPF eligibility, do associate's degree holders get credit for those 2 years towards their RPF
You
eligibility?
get full 2 years if it's an SAF program, accredited program.
Okay.
But I will make comparisons to other programs that are not SAF accredited. I will compare it to the accredited program and give them credit where they have comparable curriculum.
Okay.
Any other questions? If not, that concludes my report.
Thank you. It's now 11:06. We're going to, I'm sorry, public comment before I put us in recess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have a card. To follow up on the executive officer's report, we are watching SB 69 very closely. We've met with the staff from Senator Wiener's office and haven't seen any changes. Not only does it deal with the application of the ASP rules across the entire state, there also is rather broad language about operations on unstable features. And I think it'd be useful for Bill Short's sitting in the room to get CGS engaged to take a look at that language, because it's very, very broad in its nature. Could be a very broad application. Thank you.
All right, it's 11:07. I'm going to put the board in recess until 11:15.
Matt?
Order. And we are at item 10 on our agenda, which are the reports of standing committees and some reporting and at least one action, I believe. So let's start with Forest Practice Committee, Member Wade.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Forest Practice Committee did meet on Tuesday afternoon. We had 4 items on the agenda that I'll summarize for us, and then I'll bring a few informal issues to the board's attention for some consideration, but there are no actionable items to be brought forward. So item 1 was regarding the department's survey and monitoring of the exemptions and notices. The board did write a letter to the department dated April 30th with several comments, including a recommendation to hold the full report back until the next statutory required date, which is December 31st, 2019. We did get a really thoughtful response from Eric Huff. We went through our letters, items in our letter, item by item, and then actually presented an expanded report for our consideration, just to fully flesh out what they had intended, which does appear to include a little summary of each of the sample areas. So it's really a lot of interesting detail, and I think it's very beneficial. But they did take the board's recommendation to hold the presentation and report back from the legislature. And so this is available online, I believe, so I would recommend that board members and others have a look at
The
this.
expanded version
Yes.
is available.
Yes. So we just didn't have the capacity to make a bunch of copies up here at Chico, so that was that. The second item on the agenda, or I'm not really going in any particular order, but we had a presentation from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife pertaining to their concerns about addressing botanical resources and THPs. As you might recall, we had a nice letter from them back in November responding to our request for issues that the board might consider prioritized. And they outlined their concerns at that time fairly in detail. This was more or less a refocusing on those concerns. We had a nice discussion, probably lasted about an hour. Basically trying to sort out to some degree what more specifically those concerns might be. Some of the departments, the Department of Fish and Wildlife's more specific concerns about how things are addressed under basically in a CEQA context. And so it was left, we could have gone on, but we had to get on with other matters. So we left it in a bit of a vague state that we wanted to have board staff consider their capacity for putting together a small working group to further the discussion of these topics, trying to flesh them out and focus on a little bit more of the specifics of what the concerns are. And so this was not a prioritized item for the Forest Practice Committee for this year, so we are a little challenged in having the time to deal with it now, but we thought certainly it merits continued attention on the part of the committee to make sure that the discussion is carried forward in some way, shape, or form. So with that, we would just leave it, I think, with the board's approval to leave it to staff to try to put together a small working group that would include Fish and Wildlife, perhaps a board member, and a board staff member to try to focus in on some of these things in more detail. Kind of looking at that.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Does that seem like a reasonable paraphrasing of the outcome? Okay. All right. Great. Okay. Then third item was just a review of our effort, board staff's effort to put together information about Bellward Buncher harvest and watercourse lake protection zones. And this again was a non-regulatory effort to try to inform both the RPF community and CAL FIRE and the board's intent to encourage this type of activity for a variety of reasons, one of which is just for better fire protection or to treat the landscape more continuously, the recognition that some places these areas are actually being not treated and carry higher densities of vegetation, actually have higher fire danger than we're used to, especially with shifts in climate.
Those came up on our field trip.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
So, board staff, Randy Goss, has done, I think, really wonderful work, very well organized narrative first, and then she put together an extensive outline that covered the issues, and also then has links to references to all the academic background that formulated these her opinions. So this is still a bit of a working process in that what's lacking right now is a summary of the BMPs that might be put forward So we agreed to work on that a little bit more, flesh out the introductory narrative about the topic with the goal of getting that fleshed out and then having a complete product to, again, provide to our gift community and to CAL FIRE, re-expressing the board's intent to try to see this work. Okay, so I would encourage the board to look at these things. They're online, or they would be in the board finer materials for this month. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I would recommend you do. And lastly, we did have a continuing discussion of the potential revision to 1052.4, the emergency notice for fuel hazard reduction. And we took up where we had left off in a workshop that we had on April 3rd. So from the last board meeting, we had a entire workshop to go over the issues again, and we spent considerable time in committee 2 days ago to try to nail down some of these concerns and various elements of this bill package, so we can come to some resolution or some consensus about what to do. So some of the things that we had, well, so Eric then has managed to produce for us in a short amount of time the document as it exists now in discussion form, and that was given to all the board members so you can see kind of where we are on it. I'd like to point out a few things. One is there was continuing discussion about a QMD standard for the residual stand at that's kind of evolved to where the utility of that, the value of that standard is questionable. So this most current version actually just eliminated the QMD standard altogether. So basically we're relying on several different stand parameters to create or to describe a post-harvest stand. One is just the narrative or the instruction that we're going to have a well-distributed canopy of dominant and codominant trees. So that sets a standard. We have potential for a QMD, canopy cover, basal area, and a maximum tree size to be cut. They're basically 4 different things that would create the post-harvest stand. All right, so we eliminated QMD with respect to the resource constant, the basal area. What you'll see on page 3 of 8 on line 14 is that we settled on, at least in the interim, on Stockton standards, meeting minimum resource conservation standards of 912.7, and that would be 85 square feet base area for site 1, 50 square feet for site 2 and below. Then, and I'll get back to that in a minute. With respect to a minimum diameter, we had a couple of options. One was a standard limit, one was a maximum diameter limit. The other was to eliminate any diameter other than to insert the language regarding large old trees consistent with the exemptions, in that we would have a limit of 48 inches that can be cut, except that if an RPF justifies the harvesting of the tree larger than 48 inches, then, and then 48 or 60 inches on the coast, then that would be the standard for diameters. And then lastly, we have a 30%, in this current version, is a 30% canopy closure. We also settled on fuel standards that are somewhat, fuel treatment standards that are somewhat simplified from what they have been in the current, what they are currently in the rule. This would require a 9-inch residual height of consider debris on the ground that would apply to the 500 feet areas on either side of roads, ridge tops, infrastructure, et cetera, and structures. And then the 18-inch standard would apply only to the area where we have this quarter-mile area that you can operate in a community field, or in designated communities, using a particular term, but you have a 500 to 1,300 feet area that an 18-inch slash standard would apply. So I hope I'm being reasonably clear.
Yeah.
So, a couple things is so a couple things is that with respect to the stalking standard, what was expressed in the committee was that there shouldn't really be any difference between a Site 1 standard. Why would Site 1 create a different scenario for a fuel hazard reduction or fuel break than Site 2 and below? So you have the minimum resource conservation standards for 85 feet that would constrain you in a Site 1 scenario, but what is the logic of having that constraint or that higher base area standard in a Site 1 scenario versus Site 2 and below? So I wanted to focus on that and see if we couldn't continue that discussion. We have a few ideas as to what could happen. And one would be that we have the ability to change our base area stalking standards under 4561.2. But that would require justification. That requires some justification that would, or staff felt would be, quite an added burden to come up with that justification. And then Eric Page is doing some more recent examination of the stalking elements of the rules, and put forward just informally that this was out of committee subsequent this morning, recognize that we could insert a qualification about stalking standards in the stalking rules themselves, which are subject to board regulation. So we can qualify fuel break in the stalking rules itself. Description of site, class.
By exception, or say within a fuel break, this standard applies.
Yeah, Eric, go ahead.
So the statutory minimum resource conservation standards in 4561 are 85 square feet of basal area, 50 on everything except Site 1. And then the site classification standards are also defined, or the site classification also has a statutory definition, which is a determination or designation by the board regulations related to site potential productivity of sites. So previously, when the board adopted the fuel break special prescription standards in 1997, they had made a determination that the potential productivity of those fuel break areas took a backseat to the values that were created by the fuel break. And so therefore in 913 in the silviculture objectives, there's a statement to that effect in that because of the reduced potential productivity of these areas, all the fuel break areas were to be designated as Site 4 classification. So the board, if the board were to make a similar determination that these notice of emergencies.
So we're designating them as less productive sites, not based on their productivity, but on the purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah. A bit of a kludge there, but okay.
Yeah. So that's how it was done previously. It's really if their potential productivity is based off of their use, then the board is within the board's authority to make a similar determination that the potential productivity of those sites for emergency notice fuel hazard reduction is reduced, and that if the existing minimum resource conservation standards of 50 square feet meets all the silvicultural objectives of the rules in the Act, then it would be appropriate to utilize that 50 square feet. So it will be within the board's authority to make similar determination that all the emergency notice utilize reduction areas for the site work as well.
And did you cover that the board has done this already?
Yes, the board did this. It wasn't as explicit, but in 1997, this was the authority that the board.
Just a comment here. Be careful, these are not field breaks. These are hazard reductions. Field breaks are something very different. This is a much expanded over a linear, these are not linear features necessarily, because part of it is about protection around structures that are not necessarily linear. We need to be really careful not to use that terminology to describe this, which is not a field break. And that came up yesterday too. It's important because we will have things created by this.
That are area treatments.
That are
rather
area
than
treatments and not linear, around linear structures. So it's important not to use that terminology. It appears nowhere in this, and I don't think that it will. Field breaks have a specific definition, and we need to adhere to it. We need to check what it is in the forest practice rules and make sure we either change it in here or we're consistent with what the definition is when we talk about them. Because if we say field break, then everybody else is thinking, just be careful about that. It's very different. There's important reasons for that.
Exactly, and the field break is used, to identify the historic precedent and how these rules were adopted. The determination would have to be specific to the emergency notice.
Yeah, and this is an expanded use to provide hazard reduction in many different ways that exceed that.
Yeah, and so the determination would have to be specific for this application.
Okay, that's good staff, good point, good discussion, yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you.
So you'll be coming back to us on that one?
Yeah, so hopefully next month, and I might just.
Can we make comments on this?
Yeah, may I make a suggestion really quick? We got a couple things that we're gonna, may I?
Please.
So we have to prepare for next month the companion documents that are gonna initiate the rulemaking on this issue. That's kind of the goal of what the committee had. The discussion that you need to have today and the decision you need to make is, number one, are we gonna do this as an emergency? Or number two, are we gonna do the standard rulemaking? Staff is recommending to move forward as an emergency rulemaking effort, which initially we will ultimately have to engage in standard rulemaking on this. But given the desire to increase pace and scale of forest treatments, the desires that have been, we'll just leave it at that. It seems like, as well as the conditions that we have seen yesterday and have heard about in the news and the wildland fire issues, we feel that it is relatively easy at this point to justify this as an emergency. So number one, that's the discussion and the decision, emergency or standard rulemaking. And then number two, I think it is healthy at this point to have the discussion about the various pieces again that Rich has brought up, because it would be essentially a waste of our time, staff time, to prepare all the rulemaking documents, bring them forward, have the discussion next month, resulting in significant revisions to those rulemaking to the companion documents, resulting in a month of delay and so on and so forth. So we would like to have some congruence from you or some direction on what you want to see in this text that's going to inform us in preparing the rulemaking documents. So number one, emergency or not, and number two, addressing some of the issues that Rich has brought up, and Member Wade has brought up.
I'll just say that I have a lot of comments on this, and I think it would take a long time. I would like to provide those comments. I can provide them in writing. I don't know how that relates to the questions you have, but since we got it 30 seconds before we started talking about it, I just like to have an opportunity to provide some of those comments without, I just got it. I mean,
Right, and it wasn't the intent really to force anyone to make any choices here. It was just to inform you as to where we were and what the focal point of the discussion seemed to be. So
by all means, we would need to have, I don't know, perhaps we'd have another workshop or something.
We could have a workshop, or you could just set it aside for a month, introduce the text. I raised the issues that you have raised for consideration with the expectation that we're not going to do any staff work on it until we have direction and clarity on which way we're going to go. That would represent at least a month's delay. So we could have a workshop as well, but we need to have clarity on what we're going to have contained within the regulatory text, as well as direction on what path that we're going to take before we're going to expend a significant amount of energy on moving this forward for this board.
I didn't understand what you were saying about what you needed to have when you, I just didn't understand what you were saying when you introduced what we needed to make decisions on and how that would relate to the ability to make comments on what we just got.
Sue, would you be okay putting your comments in writing and getting back to our committee? And then maybe at that point, we could, if there was some major issue to hash out.
I have no problem making comments. I just don't understand how that fits into the process that Matt just described.
Maybe it's best. I don't have a good solution, actually. I really don't have a good solution. It seems as though Rich has raised the issue of, you've raised the issue of QMD and offsetting that by
right. So we've got
not using the QMD metric as a necessity to engage with this type of management regime.
Yes.
No diameter limit at this particular point. The site class issue and dropping the floor of minimum stocking in the site one. Those seem to be the three issues that you raised at this point. Is that true? And then you disclosed that the slash treatment had been modified, and the committee felt comfortable with that issue.
Yes. And at 30% canopy.
And 30% canopy, right.
Describing both sides.
Well, and on the diameter, just to clarify, there is a limit by the big tree.
Yeah, that's true, the large tree laws. So we can have the discussion today about those metrics. We could not have that discussion today about those metrics. We could set those aside for a workshop, or we can have that discussion at the next board meeting.
Yeah, I don't think we have the time at this meeting or the preparation to go through and have that kind of discussion. I think the issues you've raised and the issue in terms of congruence with our other policy and terminology, it feels like some staff work or a workshop could be useful. I do think that where I understand the staff time limitations. I think in general, for things like this, the mandate we've been given from the governor and from the legislature less directly is to move forward expeditiously. So I generally think of emergency rulemaking followed by regular rulemaking, and then, we anticipate this might well move quickly into regular rulemaking is the path I would think. We do, although and we still do have enough, yeah, okay. I think the real question is, would there be enough participation in the workshop to hire some of these out enough? I don't think we're going to be ready before the next meeting to give staff direction to prepare the documentation for regulatory action regardless.
I feel that we could work with members to find a date as soon as physically possible based on the premises that we need to comply with Act 18 on noticing.
Right.
So if we were efficient in our planning, we might be able to notice a workshop as early as tomorrow or the next day for sometime 10 to 12 days out of the future. But I would really strongly encourage members to participate in person in that workshop so that we could work through some of these issues, if at all possible. And then once we've worked through these issues, I think that we might have enough direction. I should say this, based on the outcome of that workshop, we may have enough direction to prepare the associated rulemaking documents for the June meeting.
Okay, then let's provisionally say, let's try and schedule something in which you could be a participant. I would actually like to be a participant in that
Okay.
as well.
Sure.
But let's make yours calendar
My calendar's pretty open.
primary.
I'm just saying, I didn't understand the process that I should use
Yes.
to make
No, I
comments
understand.
while the document was still in committee. And because I'm not on that committee. So that, I still don't understand that. I mean, I'm very flexible on how I give these comments to you guys. It isn't, I'm not trying to hold anything up. I just didn't understand the process at all.
We're just gonna recommend it be open and transparent, and do it in a public forum, rather than using any other means of communication at this point to other members of the board.
I think the workshop format has been working pretty well for us.
I think it really does.
Yeah.
It works pretty well.
I mean, it takes extra time from everybody, but since it's working, I think we're willing to put in time.
And so she's going to, thanks to Member Willis for making some suggestions on the way we proceed, which is some part of the motivation for the way we've been trying to proceed on this. Okay.
All right, very good. So then we'll look for,
We'll look for an email very soon.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in participating in that specific workshop, I would respectfully request a rapid response on dates of participation.
Okay. Good.
all right. Okay, that concludes.
Great. Thanks. Okay, let's turn to Mr. Chase for report from the management committee.
You bet. Management committee had a productive meeting yesterday. Had four items on the agenda. We have no action items for today, so it's really just a reporting, but on two of the agenda items, we have directed staff to go ahead and start preparing the ISOR and rules lead for presentation at the June meeting. So the conversation is really dominated by the first two items on the agenda. I'll cover those, and then the second two we covered fairly quickly. So the first was on potential revision of stocking standards, and we made some good progress there, reviewing a draft fleet that was refined at a workshop that we held last week that was very well-attended and very productive. So we worked through that and made some relatively minor changes to the draft that Dan prepared after the workshop. Again, directed staff to prepare the rule fleet and the ISOR. Rachel from the William Main Foundation is going to be involved in the drafting of the ISOR and establishing and integrating the ecological goals into that ISOR, which are critical. And this probably will require one additional workshop, not so much to discuss the language in the draft fleet, but to discuss the actual survey methodology and the protocols associated with surveys. I'll get into that in a little bit more depth here in a minute, but I think YG agreed to reach out to the RPF community and some folks and bring them in and kind of work through the nuts and bolts of that survey protocol to ensure that everyone's comfortable with it. So essentially where we've landed thus far on the stocking standards, it's a reduction in the point count to 200 point count minimum on the coast for Site 1 and Site 2 land, 125 point count on the coast for Site 3, and 100 point count for Sites 4 and 5. Inland, minimum of 125 on Sites 1, 2, and 3, and 100 on Sites 4 and 5. That's a pretty dramatic reduction, but it's substantiated by quite a bit of research that was done by the main group and has had quite a bit of input from various sectors and interested stakeholders. And I think it appears all are pretty comfortable with where we've landed in the establishment of these minimums. And keep that in mind, that is what we're establishing as a minimum. There was some concern raised at the workshop, and I think very valid concern about the consequence of a significant reduction in the point count if we don't adjust the point value of trees in different diameter classes. You could essentially meet stocking with a very low tree per acre count. that would undeniably be grossly understocked. And so what we did was essentially reduce the point value commensurate with the reduction in point count stocking for each of the various site classes, coast and inland. So, for example, previously 12-inch trees had a point value of 6. That has been reduced inland down to 3, and on the coast down to 4. And so as you kind of work through the math on it and see where you land, it seems to be pretty well aligned with where we're at as far as basal area minimums, and it all seems fairly rational.
And in closer congruence with the stocking rules as we move up the coast?
Correct.
In those comparison tables?
Yes. Yeah. No, it aligns fairly well, and I can walk you through maybe. Dan, you might get to it quicker, but
I think I have the form that we
handed out. Well, you're digging with that.
Yeah.
For that, I'll take through a couple of the other changes that we made. So that's the primary changes, revision of the point count stocking standards. Secondarily, we integrated some language that could give the RPF the ability to explain and justify alternative basal area stocking levels for all prescriptions, but in no case can those drop below the minimum resource conservation standard of 85 square feet for site 1, 50 for sites 2 and lower. The other change that we made was a reduction in the trees per acre required under the commercial thinning prescription for stands with a post-harvest diameter, average diameter less than 14-inch DBH. That relied on a point count standard, and we reduced that point count standard down to 100 on the coast, and this is just for stands with an average diameter less than 14, 100 on the coast, and 60 in the north and south. This is primarily being used in plantations that are receiving the commercial thin fairly early on in their in the stand's life, and reducing it down to 60 seems in line with management objectives for those types of stands. So that's essentially where we landed on the stocking standard. I think we seem to have pretty good consensus in both the workshop and in the committee meeting yesterday, and so we directed staff to go ahead and prepare the ISOR and YG. I hope we were able to reach out to folks, and the issue with that is the methodology used to determine whether or not a unit meets stocking, and it's a series of concentric circles, based on various values that the RPF or the individual doing the survey uses to determine stocking. And so obviously when you reduce the stocking rate, it reduces the size of the concentric circles. That's one sort of unintended and unfortunate consequences. We're gonna wind up with some pretty obscure plot sizes on this because of the changes that we've made, but I don't think that's insurmountable, and I don't think I think we can find a way to implement that. So, any questions on stocking? One thing we should make sure is, to consider the intersection with what Forest Practice Committee is working on with their fuel break defensible space issue and that 913D language in the rule with respect to fuel breaks and defensible space considered Site 4. And we were actually going to integrate that language into the stocking bill because there's a portion of this stocking standard that references that fuel break defensible space prescription. So, the second, any comments or anybody have anything to add? Mark, you?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay.
One thing, Chris, I would say is that we may, depending on how fast we're able to put together, to work with YG, William Bain Group, and amongst ourselves to actually identify plot radii as it results in, or as it relates to the post-harvest surveys. We may try to host a workshop on that particular issue as well, if necessary. We'll see how obscure or unique that these plots would be, and if it seems like it's going to be challenging or not, but we may or may not.
Well, my gut says it's just a math problem.
It is a math problem.
And it's not that complicated. We just gotta make sure that the community and stakeholders are comfortable with where we landed and there's not some issue that we're not considering.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay. The second agenda item was discussion of the post-fire recovery regulations, and we all saw that in action yesterday in Paradise, Magnolia. Again, we instructed staff to prepare the regulatory documents for the June meeting. We evaluated multiple options, and Eric did an excellent job of laying out multiple options, and we considered all of them and discussed. And here is where we landed, and I guess just, speaking personally, I thought yesterday's tour was really illustrative and really demonstrated why we need this and what we need to do to make this as effective as it needs to be to enable cleanup of these communities. So where we landed was making the dead or dying tree the trigger point. So a dead or dying tree within 300 feet of an approved structure, whether that structure is damaged, destroyed, or not, but within 300 feet becomes the trigger. And then with respect to events that would enable the use of this particular exemption, we've left in two options. One is within a gubernatorially declared emergency area. In the absence of that, the landowner can request that an RPF certify that the trees are dead and dying because of a wildfire that occurred within 3 years of submission of the exemption. So there is a time limit on it. But that would require involvement of an RPF. Just to kind of clarify, because we had some discussion about this as far as what other options landowners have other than this exemption. And really what they've got is the emergency. That's their other option to address the tree mortality. With that requires, the archaeological, more comprehensive archaeological work, and also requires RPF, which can be very challenging, after an event like this where RPFs are really at a premium. So I think I'm comfortable with where we landed. I thought it was a good discussion. Mark, you want to add any more to that?
I think that the main thing is we just really trying to find ways to make it as easy as possible for people to clear some of these trees out of their property. So we're just trying to figure out how to remove as many barriers as possible.
Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought, and looking at it by limiting it to trees within 300 feet of an approved structure, the risk of somebody abusing this, I think is really small. And the potential benefits, as we saw yesterday, are really substantial, and especially given kind of the haphazard nature of, some of these fires and the homes that survived, some of them unscathed, and, in neighborhoods where everything else was devastated. I think it highlights the importance of just being able to clean that up and move forward. So, again, yesterday's tour I thought was very informative. So, any other comments or questions on?
I like your line of thought on how to trigger and make that work for me.
Okay, good. Very quickly then, to the last two agenda items, state forest regulations revision. Most of the regs that this board approved several months ago have been approved by OAL and will go into effect on July 5th. There was one point regarding collection of information from users of campgrounds that OAL did not believe provided the adequate clarity and transparency that's required. And so the state forest managers are weighing in on that language, and we will work through that and for resubmittal to OAL once that language gets finalized. But all the other regulations will go into effect on July 1. And then the final agenda item was a discussion on potential revisions to categorical exemptions. And basically what this proposes to do is clarify exempt activities, exempt from CEQA, for certain board actions. And examples of that are potentially state forest management plans, the state fire plan, SRA boundaries, etc. And so we got kind of an overview by staff, had some discussion about it, some clarification, and staff is going to continue to refine and work through this and come back to us when complete. But this is lower priority than the first two agenda items. So, Mark, anything else to add from our meeting yesterday?
No, well, we're going to continue learning more about CEQA.
Yes, sir. That concludes our report.
Member Asari, resource protection.
Yeah, one actionable item, you will recall that we brought the fire protection policies forward last month. Agreed that we've been working on them for a long time, but we agreed that they should go back to committee and that and Chairman Gillis went through the revisions that he had discussed with the full board, and so he proposed those, and he can go through them. They're basically editorial, but then we also got a couple of additional comments from CAL FIRE that you received last night, small adjustments. And so the committee is now ready to bring this forward to the full board for approval, knowing that, we'll be continuing to work on the policies as a whole as they come in. So we have an option here. I can make a motion that the fire protection policies be approved.
Well, I think we should ask if it's agency or public comment first.
Okay. So is there agency or public comment on this latest version? Oh, Helgi has some great.
Real briefly, with the edits that Edith incorporated with our comments from last night, we are fine with these.
Anything else? All right, well, I'll make a motion that these be approved.
Second.
Board discussion of the motion? Good, I think these are great, worth rereading from time to time for the whole board member, because they are a comprehensive listing of our policies that we've established for firefights action. Seeing no further board discussion, call the question, please.
Wade?
Aye.
Usari?
Aye.
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 Delbar? Aye. Los Muertos?
Aye.
Chase?
Aye.
Gillis?
Aye.
Motion passed unanimously.
So this second part of the committee meeting was devoted to continued discussion of board policies relating to utility rights of way. And we had a very good turnout in our committee meeting from all of the utilities, really, this time. And with the help of CAL FIRE staff, Mike Wilson, and also just all the members of the representation from the utilities who worked all the way through them, and actually are ready for staff to start to put them in the normal format, rules format, for us to continue to consider at our next committee meeting. It was a great meeting, and as usual, I learned a lot about utility infrastructure, but still need to know more. So, do you have any other comments about how that went?
I think it was a very productive meeting, and I think we've got stuff that'll be intelligible at this point as to what the board's policies need to look like on this. So, and I really appreciated the really widespread support we got for the revisions, both in workshop and in the meeting, from people that know a lot more about continuous connectors and for most of technical issues than, yeah.
Yeah, it will take a while.
Right, I had physics in 1974 and I haven't studied electricity since. So.
Yeah, I think it'll continue on for a while. Some of these policies, I did not know this, have not been revised since the 80s. And there's just some.
The technological changes
are immense in that area. So that's comments.
And I don't know how this will land, but I almost wonder if the utility clearances should be relative to the fire hazard mapping, and that we actually are requiring them to change practices just like we're doing homeowners. And I don't know how that lands, or even if that's, I didn't see it explicitly in here, but it just occurred to me yesterday when I'm watching the wood poles go up. And maybe there is a limitation of the wood poles, but maybe we can focus on high fire hazard zones and have different explicit requirements around that to map and promote. If landowners are going to be, or homeowners are going to be doing different kinds of things on these zones, then I would think the utility companies should follow suit as well.
Well, yeah,
They already are.
They are, but the interesting way to characterize our discussion was part of this is feeling your way forward within the differential regulatory purview of the CPUC and the Board of Forestry.
Right.
And this is a very interesting part of our code in that, you're trying to deal with two dangers. One is the risk of the infrastructure on a pole to creating a wildfire, and the other is the danger to the stuff on the pole from a wildfire approaching the pole. So normally we only work in one direction on that context, and it's also unusual text, which is why seeing it in cleaned up form I think will be useful to the whole board. The notion that there are more than 2 million poles out there, but these clearance issues, because of the nature of the hazard they pose, only applies to a little over 200,000 of them. So most of the rule is about the exception. So it's saying, here's the clearance requirement, but here are all the things which knock a pole out of clearance requirements. So as we were talking about that and cleaning up what references to technology should be in there and how specific. And the third part we were looking at, which is the place where maybe we have the most overlap with stuff that's on the CPC, is around the lines and stuff. It's a fascinating discussion, and I think with all the comments we received are cleaned up. It's worth the whole board to look at that, because I think we all need to be very clear what our regulatory piece of this puzzle is relative to the CPUC, which I think we need to understand, even if that will, of course, inevitably remain fuzzy in the minds of the general public, for who, we're all part of the state.
Needed as a comment.
Just really quickly, Member Losartos, those concerns will also probably be, there's two pieces to this. There's updating these section 1250 utility-related requirements, and then there's also some components of the forest practice rules. So we're first doing this section of it, and then we'll look at the forest practice rules, where I think the issues that you're talking about are more, they're certainly relevant here, but more appropriate, more relevant when we look at those. So I don't know what committee or anything those are going to land in, but there's more than just
I think
this
the
one,
whole
actually.
board is going to need to stay very informed on this, because given the high profile of this issue, it's one that I think we'll want the whole board to be on board with the underlying issues. And I felt we've made a long way towards being able to bring it to the full board in a way that we can discuss what the issues are in a far more organized fashion.
Yeah, well, so that's the end of my report.
Thank you. With apologies to people for the way I like to run meetings, I'm pressing on here. And we're going to skip item 11 on our agenda. We'll move that to next week. Ms. Harrell can't be here today, so we'll push that off a bit. And we'll move to item 12. And I believe that Mr. Stapleton will open the hearing on the initial hearing on registered professional forester and certified specialty amendments.
Thank you, Chair Gillis, members of the board. Dan Stapleton, licensing officer for the board. We have before you the registered professional forester and certified specialty amendments 2019. I hereby open this initial hearing. These regulations that we're proposing here were developed over a one-year period in 2018 after much discussion and review. And I'd like to state that these changes clarify the role of a professional society or a public agency in the registration of professional forester regulations in regard to a specialty. And it includes insertion of the word certificate, specialty certificate, and certified specialist where necessary throughout the body of this text. It also inserts a new section, 1611.5, which identifies and clarifies that there are other professional standards and responsibilities outside of the professional forester's law that specialists and RPS have liability for. It also changes and clarifies that all complaints of a certified specialist shall be submitted to the PFEC for review to determine if there are any violations of the licensing regulations. It also provides that professional societies and public agencies submit a program of certification, that it clarifies the certification process and the requirements that the program must fully protect the public interest. And it also provides for the continuation of the existing program for certification until the board either amends or rescinds that document. So behind tab 12, we have the rule text, the initial statement of reasons, and then we had one public comment submitted behind the ISOR, and this was from the California Pacific section of the Society for Range Management, and it's a letter of support, and we have not received any other comment for this. Behind that, we have the final statement of reasons that we've developed for this regulation, and we ask you to consider this, and I'm here to answer any questions.
Thank you. Before I open for agency or public comment, are there any questions, Mr. Stapleton?
I just want to say that I attended quite a few of the committee meetings as we went through this process in the last year, as many as I could. And I think the committee, the PFEC, was very thorough and really tried to get comments, and we did a workshop and to try and try to make sure that everybody was included in this process. And I think the product that they came out with was where it needs to be. And so it took a lot of consideration and time, and Dan, you spent a lot of time on it as well, and we tried to go a lot of different directions to make sure we were coming up with the right direction for the program, and I think we landed there with this.
Yeah, I was particularly impressed. I liked the wording, frankly, on relationships with other professional societies. Member Los Orchos.
Are there parallel professional societies that are regulated by a state agency like this?
I am not aware of any other than there may be some under the business, organized under the Business and Professionals Code. Yeah, it's mostly for professionals and nurses and doctors and such.
Right, and they have their own boards and, and such. So that's why I was asking, because it just seemed like such a different model than what I've seen in the state code, and I just was curious if there's another
none that I'm aware
kind of manages this high touch. It seems like a high touch responsibility for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there are state analogs.
There must be.
Any agency comment?
We support it.
Any other agencies involved? Great. Any requests for public comment?
Curtis, is there anything?
Mr. Gentry?
As a former licensing officer, this regulation is one of the better regulations I've ever seen written. It's way overdue. I echo all the comments that Member Delbar made. A fantastic job.
Great. Well, seeing no further requests for comment, I'm going to close the hearing, and I will allow Member Delbar the honor of making a motion here.
Make a motion that we.
Remember, this would be to approve the ISR.
Right. Gotta get it correct in here. To approve the ISR for the registered professional forest groups.
And let the record show it's a final statement, it's FSOR.
Oh, it's
Yes,
a
thank you.
final statement. That's right.
With the changes added.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
Seconded by Member Sorry. Board discussion. Seeing none, please call the question.
Wade,
Aye.
sorry,
Aye.
Janai,
Aye.
Elmar,
Aye.
Los Muertos,
Aye.
Chase,
Aye.
Gillis,
Aye.
motion passes unanimously.
Member Delmar, would you like to move to adopt the rule text as distributed?
Yes. I'd like to make a motion to approve or the rule adoption,
The rule
special
text, right.
rule text, excuse me.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any board discussion? Seeing none, please call the question.
Wade,
Aye.
sorry,
Aye.
Janai,
Aye.
Elmar,
Aye.
Los Muertos,
Aye.
Chase,
Aye.
Gillis,
Aye.
motion passes unanimously.
Thank you very much, and please convey our thanks for all their diligent work back to the PMPC members.
I would just like to state that it is possible there might be some very minor, non-substantive changes that would be required by OAL as we submit these documents, and so we would request that the board acknowledge that we would be making those minor changes.
You want a motion?
Excuse
You
me?
want a motion?
Why don't we take a motion on this one if we could?
All right, I move that should some editorial non-substantive changes to the text as distributed be necessary before submission to OAL, that we direct staff to so edit the documents.
Second.
Please call the question.
Wade,
Aye.
sorry,
Aye.
Janai,
Aye.
Elmar,
Aye.
Los Muertos,
Aye.
Chase,
Aye.
Gillis,
Aye.
motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Ms. Hennigan, I think you're going to open the next hearing for us.
Yes, so I find myself in the unenviable position of standing between the adjournment of this meeting, so I will try to make this quick. So in the past legislative season, I was gonna give a little background, but we can, this is opening the hearing for the Fire Safety Survey 2019 regulations. Excuse me. In 2018, AB 2911 was chaptered, which directs the board to work with the Office of the State Fire Marshal to evaluate every subdivision of 30 or more homes in the state in a fire risk area and without adequate secondary egress, to review them and make recommendations to improve the community's fire safety. So in order to provide a standard language to allow board staff and Office of the State Fire Marshal staff to have a consistent method around selecting these communities to evaluate across the state, we decided to develop these regulations, defining some things in statute, specifying some things in statute that were left sufficiently broad that we thought that there would be some implementation questions. So this went out for notice for 45 days, about 45 days ago. The public comment period closed Monday. We received no public comment on these regulations. And I don't unfortunately have a final statement of reasons prepared for you today, but if nobody has comments at this meeting and the board can discuss if you have any changes. But otherwise, there wouldn't necessarily be an action item today, more just directing staff to prepare the final statement of reasons for your approval and adoption at your next meeting.
Any requests for agency comment? Or public comment? Okay, and the board, we're comfortable with, based on your examination of what's before you, with directing staff to move forward with preparing a final statement of reasons? Member LaSource.
Yeah, I am, but I have a question. Okay.
Yeah.
On page 3 of 4 of the rule text, it says on the bottom, line 23, 4.5 in there. The board shall maintain a list of subdivisions identified in 26, 12, 6, and 701. How are we going to get that information?
Your staff there are some data sources we could utilize, but otherwise your staff, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, get to evaluate every single subdivision of 30 or more homes in the state.
Is there a requirement that they're actually forced to make available to us, or are you going to, I mean, this is like, I just worry that this is an impossible feat to monitor things that no one's actually submitting us reports about.
Well, so we do have in the governor's budget money for 2 more land use planning staff board. There is money in the budget to hire technical consultants to help us work on this. And we also are going to be working with the land use planning team. They have staff augmentation in the governor's budget to complete this work. I think you might have seen in the Sacramento Bee lately, the Klatchy group already did some research about this for us. So those are the groups neighborhoods we're going to be hitting first, I think. And one of the other great things about the land use planning program is they work really intimately with these communities. And so we already have a lot of really great relationships where we can reach out to them and say, hey, we're here to do this work. Where should we go? These are our parameters that we're looking for. So it is a massive undertaking. I'm going to work with the land use planning program at Fire Marshal's office to make this as efficient for us as possible. But yeah, it's rather daunting.
Is there an annual reporting process at all to the state fire marshal around?
Like from these communities?
Yeah, just
not
pulling data versus getting data pushed to you.
Right.
Totally different.
So yeah, tell me about it. So technically speaking, no. Right now, as exists in statute, the onus is on the board and the CAL FIRE staff to follow up on implementation with this. And I wouldn't rely on this, of course, because anything can happen. But I am working with Senator Jackson's office. There's other pieces of legislation. There's a lot of legislation proposing land use planning changes, and in them, we've inserted, in your safety element, you have to report on the progress of, implementing the board's recommendations from this report. So we're trying to build in, and this is a problem regarding a lot of fire hazard projects. They're supposed to do certain reports or certain projects, and they kind of never tell the state.
Right.
And then people ask us, well, what's the status of this? And it's like,
right.
So I am working to find ways that we can kind of make this more of a receiving information, the local jurisdiction pushing it up rather than us having to continually ask them.
So in that vein, you might consider making a priority for next year to just make a list of all the stuff we're pulling, so that next time you're working with a senator that's thoughtful about this, you can say, here's a wish list of all the things that we need the counties and municipalities to report to us. And I know you've already been doing that.
Yeah.
But it'd be nice for us to see that sort of list as it builds out someday.
Yeah, I think especially once we have more staff and we actually do really start implementing these programs, just from the 2018 legislative season, regardless of what happens in 2019 too, we'll be able to provide you a really informative matrix about all the different moving parts of the land use planning program for the board.
But of course, obviously we don't have a choice.
No, I get that.
We get to do it every 5 years.
And we get to do it every 5 years, but the thing is that we know that there's more to come on this. But basically, once we have a list, there's a plan to do something with the list.
Yeah.
Through regulation that will come from us,
Right.
we believe. And so it is going to be really challenging, and it's just, it is very fortuitous that staff has developed all these great relationships, because this could go sideways very easily without those relationships. That's what's going to be the basis of success or failure, and the land use planning staff is just so important in this process. We can't overestimate that, and I think they can make it something that we can actually do. But from being on RPC how difficult it is to get even the basic reporting on the safety elements done. So we shall see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would have been tough without the last, say, 5 years' experience.
Right.
Building relationships between the board and Chief Munya's group and the county land use people, so.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, without having them, all over the state, I can only do so much when I'm in Sacramento. So it's been really beneficial.
Okay, any other questions or comments from Ms. Hannigan? And I think we don't have any requests for public comments. I've already asked Rachel to comment. Then I'm going to close the hearing, the initial hearing on the Fire Safety Survey 2019, and I believe staff has the direction they need to move this item forward.
Yes.
Great. That brings us to public forum, and Mr. Krieger, why don't you take it and I'll check for other public comment.
It's so much easier than Stan Dixon.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was quite a presentation today by Deputy Secretary Morris, Jessica Morris. But we're really talking an incredible cultural change here that the fire situation sort of brings into focus. And to actually do these things. This whole integration was part of the field trip to the vertical and horizontal integration, all the problems and the real people that are going to make the real difference in all these different communities. It's too bad this kind of emergency sort of instigates that, but I think that it is an opportunity to make some changes, but I think that people don't realize how intensely difficult it's going to be, because things are much more complicated than the constituencies that are represented here, the whole demographics and the depletion of the forest resources and all the different opportunities that people have had to make a living, whether it's fisheries or forestry or farming. It's a whole different situation. And the hurdles that you have to get over to get so that you can do those kind of things are almost insurmountable. The demise of the family farm is an example for people to really make a go of it and build on that. And the degree that was part of the tragedy of all these fires, whether it's the car fire or the campfire, is like the incredible impact on lives and all of the material well-being that was put together, all the livelihoods, dust into dust kind of thing, literally, with this stuff. And it's a sort of a rethink about what is going to be acceptable. Have a little short conversation with Mike. There probably has to be a complete, what the requirements for building might need to be subterranean, and And all the zoning things to really take into account these high hazard wind areas and fill areas in the future. It's really intense. So I did a little 2-minute thing. I'll read you here of what I said to the Forest Management Task Force here. Appropriate to this. This I got on April 8th, I think. Thank you. They had an agenda item for partner agencies. So I said, I'm with a partner public agency. My name is Richard Ginger. I represent Forest River and been involved with all this forest thing for many years. Congratulations to you two for your appointment. Jennifer Montgomery, new director of the Forest Management Task Force, and Jessica Morris, new deputy secretary for Forest Management and the Natural Resources Agency. This, FMTF, and the hundreds of moving parts is a big deal. And the work people are doing here is very, very important. It's a big change to bring this much energy into forest action, so-called forest health. And I spoke here once before, a few months ago. It's really important to bear in mind we don't have a standard for what a healthy forest is yet. All this work. We need to have foresters, scientists. Too bad scientists didn't do a scientific evaluation of forest decline since the ad valorem tax in 1946. Really taxed on standing timber until you cut 70% of it, replaced with yield tax in 1976. These are really serious problems to deal with. We need to get foresters to agree about the different standards of health in different forest types in California, because in the drawings about a healthy forest, there's large trees. See April 2018 report on managing California's forests and watersheds by Legislative Analyst's Office. I would hope that you all have seen that. And there's no standards or incentives for landowners to come up with a portion of their forest that actually reaches culmination of mean annual increment over 100 years for most commercial species. It's like very important to have that faith, that the public to have that faith to set those kinds of standards. And a couple other quick comments about the archaeology, about non-secret archaeology. Increasing the number of archaeologists is not necessarily the answer. I don't think there is a representative here of the California Native American Heritage Commission. There needs to be some kind of a bridge because that's important. I was on the Epic versus Johnson case. One part of it was cumulative effects need to be considered. The other two, California Appeals Court rulings at 85, were adequate consultation with Indian people and adequate assurances that heritage would be protected. So I think you need to keep that in mind as you go forward. Also, tie in with the communities. We're having a big thing like Bob Kingman, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy just described. It won't be as productive perhaps with that many contractors there. But on May 11th, this Saturday, in Southern Humboldt, Northern Mendocino County Redway, we're going to have a similar kind of a get-together to cover the whole spectrum of what private landowners can do along with a contract. We need people from here that can help at places like that to describe what the different procedures are for the different available funds. We focused on that a lot yesterday. And so there's a lot of science that needs to be followed up on, whether you consider the Little Hoover Commission report, number 126 in June of 1994 to be science, or the Dunn report, to cumulative impacts, scientific basis prediction of cumulative watershed effects, UC 2001. All these things need to be rolled in and acted upon to make the kind of changes that will benefit the people. And the forestry needs to have forestry experts. You've got the communities at risk with there are two different aspects here, with the emergency affecting communities at risk and the long-term standards of forestry moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other requests for public comment?
I'm really sorry. I was instructed to hand out the department's fire prevention target goal paperwork. I will give it to you. We'll put some copies in the back.
There we go. Okay. All right. That leads us to our conclusion, and Board of Forestry and Fire Protection's adjourned.